My husband lured me to the edge of a jagged cliff on the Pacific Coast Highway under the guise of a romantic sunset photo. The moment I stepped out of our luxury SUV, the heavy thud of the electronic locks echoed over the crashing waves. He stared at me with dead cold eyes, slammed the gas pedal, and vanished into the fading light, leaving me stranded in the freezing wind. I had no idea that hours later the police would call to tell me his car had gone over a cliff with another woman inside. My name is Blair. I am 30 years old and my life changed forever on a desolate stretch of California coastline. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever survived a betrayal you never saw coming. The Pacific Coast Highway was winding and treacherous, especially as dusk began to bleed the warmth and color from the sky. Gavin gripped the leather steering wheel of our heavy luxury SUV, his knuckles slightly white against the dark material. We were driving through Big Sur, miles away from the nearest town, navigating curves that hugged the very edge of the continent. The ocean crashed against the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below us, a rhythmic, violent sound that filled the heavy silence inside the vehicle. The heater was running quietly, keeping the cabin a perfect, comfortable temperature, a sharp contrast to the aggressive weather brewing outside the thick glass windows. He pulled the massive vehicle onto a narrow gravel shoulder overlooking a sheer, terrifying drop. The horizon was burning with vibrant, fading streaks of orange and deep purple, signaling the last moments of daylight. Gavin shifted the car into park and turned to me. His expression was completely unreadable, stripped of his usual charismatic smile. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "I want to take a picture of you with the sunset." I hesitated for a fraction of a second. The wind howling outside the window looked brutal, shaking the dry brush along the guardrail. But I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the heavy passenger door open. The moment my boots crunched onto the loose gravel, the frigid coastal air cut right through my thin sweater. I took a few steps toward the rusty metal guardrail, wrapping my arms around myself, shivering as the freezing ocean mist sprayed upward from the violent surf below. I turned back toward the car with a forced, shivering smile, waiting for him to grab his phone and join me on the dirt shoulder. He never reached for his phone. Instead, the heavy mechanical thud of the electronic locks engaging echoed sharply over the howling wind. The sound was distinct, incredibly loud, and chillingly final. I stepped back toward the passenger door, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal handle. I pulled, but it refused to budge. It was firmly locked. I looked through the tinted glass, fully expecting to see a teasing smirk on his face. Gavin loved his cruel little practical jokes, but he was not smiling. He turned his head slowly and looked directly into my eyes. His stare was entirely dead and cold. There was no anger, no amusement, no flicker of human emotion at all. It was the detached, empty look of a stranger regarding a piece of worthless debris left on the side of a forgotten road. I opened my mouth to speak, pressing my bare palm flat against the freezing glass, but I never got the chance to form a single word. He shifted the heavy SUV back into drive. The engine roared, a guttural, mechanical sound that violently shattered the quiet dusk. He slammed his expensive shoe down on the gas pedal. The thick tires spun furiously against the loose gravel, spitting small, sharp rocks against my bare shins. I stumbled backward, throwing my hands up instinctively to protect my face from the flying debris. By the time I lowered my arms and opened my eyes, the dark SUV was already tearing down the winding asphalt. Its bright red taillights burned like malicious eyes in the gathering dark before vanishing entirely around a sharp, dangerous bend. I stood completely frozen on the exact edge of the cliff. My brain violently refused to process the reality of what had just occurred. The roar of the expensive engine faded rapidly into the distance, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive silence that felt heavier than the ocean. There were no other cars traveling on this remote stretch of the coastal highway. There were no streetlights, no emergency call boxes, no illuminated signs of human life anywhere in sight. There was only me, the rough, jagged asphalt, and the terrifying, dizzying plunge into the pitch-black ocean directly below my feet. The physical cold hit me like a series of brutal physical blows. The Pacific wind whipped mercilessly across the exposed cliff face, biting deep into my unprotected skin and stealing the very breath from my lungs. My light fabric sweater offered absolutely zero protection against the plunging coastal temperature. I hugged my knees, crouching low to the hard ground to avoid the harshest, most punishing gusts of wind, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. Absolute visceral terror began to claw its way up my throat, suffocating my attempts to remain calm. The sun slipped completely below the horizon, instantly plunging the winding highway into a deep, disorienting blackness. The towering shadows of the ancient coastal redwoods stretched across the empty road like long, grasping fingers. Every rustle of the dry brush, every violent crashing wave echoing from the abyss below sounded magnified and deeply threatening. I was completely alone on one of the most dangerous isolated roads in the entire country. There was absolutely no inner monologue attempting to rationalize his bizarre psychotic behavior. There was no quiet moment to ponder the state of our marriage or wonder what minor offense I had committed to deserve this punishment. My mind violently stripped away everything except the immediate primal screaming instinct to survive the elements. The biting wind roared even louder in my ears, a constant physical reminder of my extreme vulnerability. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and the darkness was now absolute. I was miles away from any form of civilization, deliberately abandoned in a desolate place where people routinely disappeared into the ocean without leaving a single trace behind. I forced my trembling, numb fingers into the pockets of my jeans, desperately searching for my phone. The device felt like a block of ice against my skin. I pulled it out and tapped the dark glass. The harsh, artificial light blinded me for a second, casting long, erratic shadows against the jagged rocks behind me. My eyes immediately darted to the top right corner of the screen. The battery icon glowed a menacing red, displaying 12%. Right beside it, the bold, unforgiving letters spelled out, "No service." I held the phone high above my head, waving it blindly in the freezing air, praying for a single bar to appear. Nothing changed. The digital clock read 8:14 in the evening. I was completely disconnected from the world. Standing still meant freezing to death. The temperature was plunging rapidly, and the coastal wind showed no signs of stopping. I had to move. I shoved the dying phone back into my pocket and began to walk. I chose to walk north, hoping the winding asphalt would eventually lead to a turnout with an emergency call box or a stretch of elevation high enough to catch a cell tower signal. My ankle boots, stylish and entirely impractical for hiking, crunched loudly against the loose gravel. The shoulder of the highway was terrifyingly narrow. On my right, the black abyss of the ocean roared, hungry and violent. On my left, the solid rock wall of the mountain offered no escape. Every step sent a jolt of pain up my calves. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my eyes with salt and freezing mist. I kept my head down, forcing one foot in front of the other, establishing a grim, desperate rhythm. Walk, breathe, shiver, walk again. The darkness was so complete that I could barely see 3 feet in front of me. I had to rely on the faint painted white line separating the shoulder from the road to keep from wandering into the traffic lane or stumbling off the cliff edge. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared around the sharp curve ahead. Within seconds, blinding white high beams swept across the cliff face, illuminating the jagged rocks in stark relief. A massive semi-truck came roaring around the bend, traveling far too fast for the winding coastal road. Panic seized my chest. I threw myself flat against the cold mountain wall, pressing my spine into the rough stone. The truck blasted past me with the force of a hurricane. The massive vacuum of displaced air violently whipped my clothes and nearly dragged me right onto the asphalt. The deafening roar faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving my ears ringing and my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, the initial shock of the abandonment began to thaw, replaced by a cold, piercing clarity. I am a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on identifying hidden patterns, exposing inconsistencies, and finding the truth buried beneath layers of deception. As I walked along that freezing highway, Gavin's pattern suddenly became glaringly, horrifyingly obvious. This trip was not a spontaneous romantic gesture, it was a calculated setup. I thought back to earlier in the afternoon. When we were packing the car, I had reached for my heavy winter coat. Gavin had snatched it from my hands with a charming laugh, tossing it back into the closet. He had insisted I would not need it, claiming the car heater worked perfectly, and we would be indoors by nightfall. He had deliberately chosen this specific isolated stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. He knew exactly where the cellular dead zones were. He knew exactly how desolate it became after dark. The heavy thud of the electronic locks engaging was not a mistake. It was a deliberately executed step in a meticulously planned equation. The realization was far more chilling than the ocean wind. The man I had shared a bed with, the man who had vowed to protect me, had driven me to a remote cliff and left me to die of exposure or get struck by a speeding car in the pitch-black night. He did not just want a divorce. He wanted me to vanish. He wanted me erased from the ledger of his life. Another set of headlights pierced the darkness behind me. I scrambled away from the white line, my boot catching on a loose rock. I pitched forward, falling hard onto the abrasive gravel. The rough stones tore through my jeans, scraping the skin off my palms and knees. The sharp, stinging pain grounded me, cutting through the overwhelming psychological terror. A sports car sped past the driver, completely unaware of the woman bleeding on the side of the road. I forced myself back up, wiping the blood and dirt from my hands onto my sweater. I could not stop. If I stopped, his plan would succeed. I walked for what felt like hours. My legs burned with lactic acid and my lungs ached with every intake of the freezing air. The 2 miles felt like an endless, punishing marathon. I pulled my phone out again, my fingers so stiff I could barely hold the device. The screen lit up. 10%. Still no service. I shoved it back, biting my lip until I tasted copper to keep from screaming into the void. The road finally began to incline, winding upward along a higher stretch of the mountain. The wind here was even more brutal, but the elevation gave me a desperate surge of hope. I dragged my exhausted body up the steep grade, my boots slipping on the slick pavement. My vision blurred with unshed tears of frustration and physical pain. I reached a small flattened turnout overlooking the vast black expanse of the ocean. I pulled my phone out for the 3rd time. The battery was at 7%. I stared at the top corner of the screen, silently pleading with the universe. Suddenly, the device vibrated violently in my frozen palm. A single solid white bar appeared in the corner. The words "no service" vanished, replaced by the name of my carrier. A wave of profound, staggering relief washed over me. I had a signal. I was going to survive. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I tapped the number 9. I tapped the number 1. I moved my thumb to press the final digit, my chest heaving with desperate anticipation. Before my finger could touch the glass, the screen abruptly changed. The keypad vanished entirely. A loud, sharp ringtone shattered the quiet night. The phone was vibrating frantically, displaying an incoming call from an unknown, out-of-state number. I stood frozen, staring at the glowing screen. Who could possibly be calling me at this exact second? I hit the green accept button and pressed the freezing glass against my ear. "Hello," I gasped, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Is this Blair?" A deep, authoritative male voice asked on the other end of the line. "Yes," I answered, my heart pounding in my throat. "Please, I need help. I am stranded on the highway." "This is Detective Ramirez with the California Highway Patrol," the voice stated, completely ignoring my plea. "I am calling regarding your husband, Gavin. There has been a severe incident." "An incident," I repeated. The freezing coastal wind whipped my tangled hair across my face, stinging my eyes. My exhausted brain violently struggled to process the detective's incredibly calm words. "What kind of incident? Is Gavin hurt?" "Ma'am, I need you to brace yourself," Ramirez said. His tone shifted smoothly into a practiced, professional sympathy that cops use to deliver the worst news imaginable. "Your husband's vehicle went through a steel guardrail approximately 10 miles north of your current location. The SUV rolled down a very steep, rocky embankment." I am very sorry to inform you that Gavin was pronounced dead on impact. Dead. The heavy final word hit me like a physical blow to the chest, instantly knocking the remaining breath from my burning lungs. My husband, the man who had just looked at me with those empty sociopathic eyes and abandoned me on the edge of the world, was gone. A bizarre, highly confusing mixture of absolute shock and a deeply inappropriate bubbling sense of relief washed over my freezing body. And the passenger Ramirez continued, his voice cutting sharply through my internal chaos. His wife. She was pulled from the mangled wreckage alive, but she is currently in critical condition. Paramedics are airlifting her to Monterey General Hospital right now. I froze completely. The dying cell phone nearly slipped from my numb, scraped fingers. His wife? I echoed, my voice completely flat and devoid of any inflection. Detective, I am his wife. My name is Blair. I am Gavin's wife. Silence stretched heavily over the line. The quiet was filled only by the crackling static of the weak cellular connection and the roaring Pacific Ocean crashing against the rocks hundreds of feet behind me. "Excuse me," Ramirez finally said. A sharp edge of genuine confusion broke right through his calm, measured demeanor. The female passenger's identification was recovered at the active scene. She had a diamond wedding band matching his exactly, and the vehicle registration. "I am his wife," I interrupted firmly. The reality of Gavin's massive, twisted deception began snapping into crystal clear focus. He left me on the side of the highway over an hour ago. He locked the heavy doors of the SUV and drove away. I have been walking in the freezing dark ever since. "Stay exactly where you are," Ramirez commanded. His tone instantly changed from a grief counselor to an active, urgent investigator. "I am dispatching a highway patrol car to your GPS ping right now. Keep your phone on." 15 grueling minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a California highway patrol cruiser finally pierced the absolute darkness. A young, serious officer stepped out of the idling vehicle. He immediately wrapped a thick, scratchy wool blanket around my violently shaking shoulders and guided me gently into the heated back seat of his car. The sudden blast of artificial warmth was agonizing as the blood rushed rapidly back into my frozen hands and feet, but I welcomed the sharp pain. It was physical proof that I was still alive. The drive north was a surreal, terrifying blur of winding asphalt and flashing emergency lights reflecting off the wet rocks. The officer up front spoke quietly into his shoulder radio, constantly relaying my status to Ramirez. I simply stared out the passenger window, watching the jagged black cliffs roll silently by. Gavin was dead. Another woman was critically injured, successfully playing the role of his devoted wife. My analytical mind spun frantically, desperately trying to reconcile the charismatic, highly successful real estate broker I had married with the cold, calculating stranger who had trapped me outside the vehicle. We rounded a sharp, treacherous bend in the road, and the desolate highway suddenly erupted into a chaotic, brilliant staging area. Massive humming floodlights illuminated the dark night, casting stark, artificial daylight over a completely torn section of the metal guardrail. Huge red fire trucks, idling ambulances, and multiple police cruisers were angled aggressively across the double yellow lines. Their heavy radios squawked constantly over the deafening sound of a massive industrial winch, groaning under immense mechanical strain. The patrol car rolled to a slow stop just behind a glowing row of orange flares burning brightly on the scarred asphalt. The officer opened my door and guided me carefully toward the center of the command center. Detective Ramirez stepped away from a group of busy first responders to meet me. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a heavy tactical jacket, his face deeply lined with the stress of managing the grim, chaotic scene. "Blair," he said, offering a firm, respectful nod. "I am Detective Ramirez. Are you injured?" "Just cold," I managed to say, pulling the thick wool blanket tighter around my freezing neck, "and scraped up from falling on the gravel." "Where is he?" Ramirez pointed a gloved hand toward the broken cliff edge. A massive heavy-duty tow truck was in the final agonizing stages of hauling the crushed remains of our luxury SUV up the steep rocky embankment. The expensive vehicle was completely unrecognizable. The strong, reinforced roof was caved in all the way down to the door handles. The thick tinted safety glass was shattered into thousands of glittering diamonds, scattered violently across the road. The front end of the car was a mangled, smoking accordion of twisted black metal and ruptured engine blocks. The heavy smell of leaked gasoline and burnt rubber hung thick in the cold air. I stared blankly at the destroyed machine. The man I had shared my life with, shared a home with, shared a bed with, was a casualty of that twisted, smoking metal. But any normal grief I might have expected to feel was entirely overshadowed by the chilling, impossible sequence of events. The flight medics took the female passenger exactly 10 minutes before you arrived, Ramirez said softly, carefully watching my face for any reaction. We found her designer purse thrown clear in the debris. Her name is Sienna. Does that name mean anything to you? Sienna, Gavin's executive assistant, the young, ruthlessly efficient, beautiful woman who managed his complex daily schedules and booked his international business flights. The sudden realization that she was sitting comfortably in the heated passenger seat wearing a fake wedding ring and pretending to be his actual wife made my empty stomach violently churn. "There is something else you urgently need to see," Ramirez said. His tone was incredibly heavy, completely stripped of any remaining comforting bedside manner. When the heavy vehicle rolled down the cliff, the violent impact popped the rear hatch wide open. The contents of the spacious trunk spilled out onto the hillside. My forensics team gathered them for evidence. He guided me slowly past the groaning tow truck to the back of his parked cruiser. He popped his own trunk, clicking on a very bright, blinding tactical flashlight into the dark compartment. The harsh white beam illuminated 3 distinct, terrifying items laid out carefully on a sterile plastic tarp. 2 large, unopened rolls of heavy-duty industrial-strength duct tape, a thick, heavy box of contractor-grade black plastic trash bags, and a brand-new forged steel shovel with the retail price tag still stubbornly stuck to the smooth wooden handle. I stared at the 3 items, my breath pluming rapidly in the freezing coastal air. My professional background as a forensic accountant trained my brain to constantly look at disparate data points, find the hidden connections, and form a complete logical picture. The terrifying equation laid out in the trunk of the police cruiser was brilliantly, horrifyingly simple. Gavin had not spontaneously decided to leave me on the side of the freezing road just to teach me a petty lesson. He had not driven away in a fit of sudden, unpredictable anger. The incredibly isolated location, the complete lack of cellular service, the specific calculated items waiting patiently in the back of the heavy SUV. It was all meticulously, flawlessly premeditated. He deliberately intended for me to freeze, to physically weaken, to be entirely isolated and helpless in the pitch-black dark. And then he intended to come back. The heavy duct tape, the thick bags, the steel shovel. A massive wave of absolute paralyzing horror washed over me, a chilling realization far colder than the bitter Pacific wind. Gavin was returning to that specific cliff to kill me. He was going to violently silence me, bag my body, and bury me deep somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Big Sur. The absolute only reason I was still breathing, the only reason I was standing in front of Detective Ramirez, instead of lying dead at the bottom of a shallow, unmarked grave, was because Gavin had taken a treacherous corner entirely too fast on his way back to finish the job. I looked away from the cold steel of the shovel and stared directly at the crushed, smoking metal of the ruined SUV. The monster I married was dead, but the nightmare was just beginning. The patrol car heater blasted dry, artificial air against my freezing face as we pulled away from the chaotic crash site, but the warmth could not penetrate the ice solidifying in my veins. The shovel, the heavy-duty trash bags, the thick rolls of industrial tape. Those images were burned into my retinas, playing on a relentless loop alongside Gavin's dead, empty stare. I sat rigidly in the back seat of the cruiser as it wound its way down the coastal mountains toward Monterey General Hospital. Detective Ramirez had insisted I be checked into the emergency room for exposure and shock. I did not argue. I needed a sterile, brightly lit space to anchor my mind. I needed to calculate my next move because the man who had meticulously plotted to murder me was now a mangled corpse. And I was stepping into a world where everyone still believed he was a successful, charming husband. Monterey General Hospital was a beacon of stark white fluorescence against the black California night. The automatic sliding doors parted with a soft mechanical hiss, granting us entry into the chaotic symphony of the emergency room. Pagers beeped incessantly. Nurses in blue and green scrubs moved with urgent practiced efficiency. The smell of strong antiseptic and bitter coffee assaulted my senses, a jarring contrast to the wild, salty wind of the cliffside. A triage nurse quickly guided me to a curtained observation bay, replacing the patrolman's scratchy wool blanket with a heated hospital gown. She gently cleaned the dirt and dried blood from my scraped knees and palms, speaking in hushed, soothing tones. I barely registered her words. My analytical brain was entirely consumed by the chilling logistics of Gavin's failed assassination plot. I was building a mental ledger of the night, organizing the terrifying variables of my survival, when a sharp, aggressive voice shattered the clinical hum of the ward. "Where is she?" the voice demanded, echoing shrilly down the polished linoleum corridor. "I want to see her right now." I recognized that imperious, commanding tone instantly. It belonged to Brenda. Gavin's mother was a retired corporate executive who wielded her immense wealth and social status like a weapon. Even at 3 in the morning, summoned by police to identify her dead son, Brenda arrived looking like she was stepping into a boardroom to execute a hostile takeover. I pushed aside the thin privacy curtain and stepped out into the main thoroughfare of the emergency department. Brenda was storming down the center of the hallway. She wore an immaculate camel-colored cashmere coat, her hair perfectly styled into an immovable helmet of silver and blonde. The moment her sharp, predatory eyes locked onto me, her face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. She did not walk toward me. She lunged. The nurses and orderly staff nearby froze, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. Before I could even brace myself, Brenda closed the distance between us and swung her arm in a wide, vicious arc. Her heavy, diamond-encrusted rings caught the harsh fluorescent light a fraction of a second before her open palm connected with my cheek. The sharp, explosive crack of the slap echoed through the entire emergency department. My head snapped to the side from the sheer physical force of the blow. A bright, stinging heat immediately bloomed across my jaw, and the metallic taste of blood seeped into my mouth from where my teeth cut into the inside of my cheek. Several nurses gasped loudly. A security guard standing near the vending machines immediately reached for his radio and started jogging toward us. "You killed him!" Brenda screamed. Her voice was guttural, completely devoid of her usual refined country club modulation. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You killed my boy." I slowly turned my head back to center. I did not raise a hand to touch my burning cheek. I did not flinch. I simply stared at her. The forensic accountant inside me cataloged her behavior with absolute chilling detachment. "He was a brilliant, successful man until he met you." Brenda shrieked, her chest heaving as she stepped closer, invading my personal space. Her expensive perfume mixed nauseatingly with the smell of hospital sanitizer. "Your suffocating middle-class mediocrity drove him to this. You dragged him down with your pathetic penny-pinching mindset. He was constantly stressed, constantly trying to escape the mundane, miserable life you trapped him in. You drove him to that cliff. You caused that crash. You are the reason my son is dead." The sheer breathtaking irony of her accusations washed over me. Brenda was hysterically blaming my lack of elite social pedigree for a car crash, completely unaware that her beloved, brilliant son had packed a shovel in his trunk to bury me in the dirt. She thought I drove him to stress. She did not know he was a calculating sociopath who had just attempted a meticulously planned murder. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now," the security guard ordered, inserting his large frame between me and my raging mother-in-law. "You cannot assault patients in this hospital. If you do not calm down, I will have you removed from the premises immediately." Brenda ignored the guard entirely, her venomous glare fixed solely on me. "Look at you." She spat, her upper lip curling in absolute disgust. He is lying dead on a metal table, and you do not even have the decency to shed a single tear. You are a cold, calculating opportunist. You never deserved him. You never deserved our family. The security guard placed a firm hand on Brenda's cashmere shoulder, attempting to guide her away, but she violently shook him off. I remained completely silent. My silence was not born of shock or intimidation. It was born of absolute terrifying clarity. Screaming back at Brenda would achieve nothing. Defending my character to a woman who had despised me from the moment I refused to sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement was a waste of breath. More importantly, telling her the truth about the duct tape and the heavy trash bags in Gavin's trunk would be a strategic error. Information was the most valuable currency in any audit, and right now I held all the cards. I knew exactly who her son was, and I knew exactly what he had tried to do. Letting her scream, letting her put her unhinged, violent behavior on public display in front of a dozen hospital witnesses was far more beneficial to me. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked onto hers with the cold, unblinking intensity of a predator studying its prey. My absolute refusal to react seemed to infuriate her even more. She wanted me to break down to cry to validate her cruel narrative that I was a weak, useless burden who had destroyed her golden child. My chilling composure was starving her of the reaction she desperately craved. The red mark on my face throbbed, but I felt invincible. The man who had terrorized my mind and abandoned me to die was gone, and this screaming, toxic woman was nothing more than a minor obstacle in the way of my survival. "You are going to pay for this, Blair." Brenda hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper as two more security guards arrived to flank her. "I am going to make sure you walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing. I will destroy you." I did not blink. I did not speak. I just watched her with ice in my veins, waiting for the storm to pass, knowing that the secrets buried in the wreckage of that SUV would eventually change everything. The heavy swinging doors of the trauma bay hissed open, breaking the tense standoff in the corridor. A tall, exhausted-looking doctor wearing scrubs stained with dark spots stepped into the fluorescent light. A blue surgical mask hung loosely around his neck, and he clutched a thick metal clipboard. He scanned the hallway, his eyes sweeping past the security guards and settling on Brenda and me. He took a deep breath, the universal medical gesture for delivering heavy news, and walked toward us. The security guards loosened their grip on Brenda, allowing her to straighten her cashmere coat and compose her features into a mask of expectant dread. "Are you the family of Gavin and Sienna?" the doctor asked, his voice low and practiced. Brenda stepped forward, completely ignoring my presence. "I am Gavin's mother," she stated, her tone demanding immediate answers. "This woman is simply the widow. Tell me what is happening. Where is my son?" The doctor offered a sympathetic, professional nod. "I am Dr. Evans. I am so deeply sorry for your loss. As you were previously informed by the police, Gavin suffered catastrophic injuries upon impact. There was absolutely nothing our trauma team could do. He was pronounced dead at the scene." Brenda let out a sharp, ragged breath, her manicured hand flying to her throat. She swayed slightly, playing the part of the devastated matriarch to absolute perfection. I remained rooted to the polished linoleum floor, absorbing the final clinical confirmation of Gavin's death without shedding a single tear. My analytical mind was already moving past the deceased, focusing entirely on the surviving variable in this horrific equation. "And the passenger?" I asked, my voice cutting through Brenda's dramatic gasps. "The woman pulled from the wreck." Dr. Evans turned his attention to me, flipping a page on his metal clipboard. "Sienna survived the crash. It is a genuine miracle considering the condition of the vehicle. She sustained multiple fractures, a severe concussion, and significant lacerations, but she is currently stabilized. Our surgical team just finished repairing a compound fracture in her right femur. She is heavily sedated and resting in the intensive care recovery wing." A sharp, stinging wave of disbelief washed over me. Sienna, the ruthlessly ambitious assistant who had managed Gavin's calendar, was lying in a hospital bed a few hundred feet away, breathing the air that Gavin had intended to permanently steal from me. She had survived the exact plunge that was meant to be my execution. But that is not the only update. Dr. Evans continued, his brow furrowing slightly as he looked directly at Brenda. We performed an emergency ultrasound to check for internal bleeding in her abdomen. We found no internal hemorrhaging. However, we did verify the status of her pregnancy. The word hung in the sterile hospital air, heavy and absolute. Pregnancy. Brenda stopped her theatrical swaying. Her hands dropped slowly to her sides. Her tear-filled eyes suddenly hardened into twin points of sharp, unyielding steel. What pregnancy, she demanded, her voice entirely stripped of grief. What exactly are you talking about, doctor? Sienna is 16 weeks pregnant, Dr. Evans explained calmly, completely unaware of the massive, explosive domestic minefield he had just stepped onto. Despite the extreme trauma of the rollover crash, the amniotic sac remains completely intact. The fetal heartbeat is remarkably strong and steady. The baby is perfectly healthy. I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. The forensic pieces of Gavin's monstrous puzzle snapped together with blinding, agonizing clarity. He was not just leaving me for a younger, prettier assistant. He was actively clearing the slate to build an entirely new life. Sienna was carrying his child. She was 4 months pregnant. That meant they had been sleeping together, plotting together, completely entwined while I was sitting in my Beacon Hill living room, oblivious to the betrayal growing right under my nose. He had packed those heavy-duty trash bags and that steel shovel to bury his barren wife, making absolutely sure his new fertile family could inherit everything we had built without the messy, expensive complications of a divorce. Brenda stood perfectly still. I watched the forensic gears turning violently in her status-obsessed brain. The grief over losing her brilliant golden son was instantaneously eclipsed by a singular biological revelation. The family bloodline was not dead. Gavin's legacy, the precious genetic continuation she had relentlessly badgered me about for years, was currently resting safely inside Sienna's shattered body. A terrifying, almost reptilian transformation overtook my mother-in-law. Her posture straightened her shoulders, throwing off the heavy mantle of the grieving mother. She became something entirely different, a fiercely protective, calculating matriarch defending her royal heir. The sudden shift in her energy was palpable, radiating a cold, ruthless authority that made the security guards instinctively take a step back. Brenda turned to face me. The absolute contempt in her eyes was staggering. She did not raise her hand to slap me again. She did not need to. Her entire physical presence was a weapon. She stepped directly into my personal space and violently shoved me backward. Her heavy hands slammed hard against my collarbone, knocking me off balance. My rubber-soled boots squeaked sharply against the polished floor as I stumbled, catching myself against the cold, painted cinder block wall to keep from falling. "You are nothing!" Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute conviction. "You are a barren, useless mistake that my son should have corrected years ago. You are entirely irrelevant to this family now." I pressed my back against the wall, maintaining my chilling, silent composure. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I refused to let her see the massive, overwhelming shock violently rippling through my nervous system. Brenda turned her back on me, dismissing my existence entirely, and focused her piercing gaze on Dr. Evans. She spoke with the commanding authority of a woman accustomed to buying compliance. "Sienna is carrying my grandchild. She is the true mother of the family bloodline. I demand to be taken to her room immediately. I will be overseeing her medical care from this moment forward. And I want it explicitly documented in her chart that this woman," she pointed a rigid, manicured finger backward at me without turning around, "is completely and permanently banned from the recovery wing. She is not family. She is a hostile threat to my grandchild. If she steps 1 foot near that ward, I will have her arrested for trespassing." Dr. Evans looked incredibly uncomfortable, clearly out of his depth in the face of Brenda's aggressive elite entitlement. He nodded slowly, gesturing down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the secure intensive care unit. "Right this way, ma'am. We can get you registered as her primary emergency contact." Brenda did not look back. She marched down the hallway, her expensive cashmere coat sweeping behind her, her posture radiating absolute undeniable triumph. The heavy automated doors of the intensive care unit hissed open to receive her, then clicked firmly shut, sealing her away in the secure, protected environment with the woman who had helped plan my execution. I was left standing completely alone in the freezing, sterile hospital corridor. The nurses quietly dispersed, returning to their busy stations, avoiding my eyes. The security guards walked away, their job finished. I was utterly isolated. I had no husband, no warm clothes, no functioning cell phone, and no family to call. I had been brutally discarded, thrown away like a piece of useless trash on the cold linoleum floor. But as I stood there in the chilling silence of the emergency department, a slow, burning rage began to thaw the ice in my veins. They thought they had won. They thought I was beaten, penniless and alone. They had absolutely no idea what a forensic accountant could do when the ledger of her life had been violently, deliberately unbalanced. I marched out of the emergency department and approached a deserted administrative desk in the hospital lobby. A glowing USB port on the side of a computer monitor caught my eye. I plugged in my dead phone, waiting in agonizing silence until the dark screen finally flickered to life, displaying a pathetic 3% battery. It was just enough to access my ride-sharing app. I requested a premium car to my home address in Los Angeles, overriding the massive out-of-town fare warning with a sharp tap of my thumb. The driver, a quiet man in a black sedan, arrived within 10 minutes. I climbed into the leather back seat, pulling the heavy door shut on the nightmare of Monterey. The drive down the coast took 5 grueling hours. The smooth, rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt did absolutely nothing to lull me to sleep. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, the stark image of the shovel waiting in Gavin's trunk violently jolted me awake. I watched the pitch-black sky slowly bleed into a bruised, muted purple and then into the harsh, unforgiving daylight of Southern California. We transitioned from the rugged, isolated cliffs of Big Sur to the sprawling, manicured concrete grids of Los Angeles. The driver pulled into my quiet, upscale neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills, the tires crunching softly against the pristine driveway. I tipped him heavily through the app and stepped out into the crisp morning air. My house stood exactly as we had left it yesterday afternoon. It was a stunning multi-million-dollar architectural marvel of glass, steel, and warm teak wood. The landscaping was flawless, the geometric hedges casting long, sharp shadows across the walkway. It was the physical embodiment of the success Gavin and I had supposedly built together. I walked slowly up the floating concrete steps to the massive oak front door. My boots felt like they were filled with lead, my muscles screaming in protest from the physical trauma and exposure of the previous night. I reached out to the sleek digital smart lock keypad integrated into the door handle. My fingers moved automatically, punching in our 6-digit anniversary date. I waited for the familiar, satisfying mechanical click of the deadbolt disengaging. Instead, the keypad flashed a harsh, solid crimson. The device emitted a low electronic buzz of denial. I paused, my brow furrowing. My frozen, scraped hands were still clumsy. I assumed I had simply mistyped the sequence. I carefully pressed the illuminated numbers again, making absolutely certain each digit registered correctly. Red light, denial buzz. A cold knot formed in the center of my stomach. I tried Gavin's personal override code. Red light. I tried the factory reset pin we kept hidden in our master files. Red light. The realization hit me with the force of a physical strike. This was not a technical malfunction. The smart home system was entirely controlled via a central app on Gavin's phone. He had not just locked the doors when we left for the coast. He had remotely deleted my access credentials. He had permanently revoked my digital key. He had locked me out of my own home before we even hit the highway. My legs finally gave out. I sank down onto the cold, polished concrete of my own front porch, my back resting heavily against the impenetrable oak door. The morning sun was rising higher, casting bright light across the affluent neighborhood, but I was shivering uncontrollably. The physical exhaustion was compounding the deep psychological shock. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. The battery icon was bleeding red, displaying exactly 2%. My forensic instincts, honed by years of tracing hidden corporate assets and exposing financial fraud, screamed at me to check the underlying architecture of our life. If he had locked me out of the physical structure, the digital framework was next. I opened my banking application. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds, searching for a cellular signal. When the dashboard finally populated, the bright, cheerful interface mocked the absolute devastation displayed on the screen. Joint checking account, $0. Joint savings account, $0. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. I navigated to my personal isolated accounts. I had maintained a separate private nest egg at a completely different banking institution since before we were married. It was a highly secure account containing $150,000 money I had meticulously saved from my first few years as a junior auditor. Gavin knew about it, but he was never an authorized signer. The screen refreshed. Available balance, $0. I stared at the numbers, my analytical mind instantly dissecting the catastrophic damage. I clicked on the transaction history, watching the digital ledger unfold the true narrative of Gavin's betrayal. The transfers were not pending, they were fully cleared. They were massive, untraceable wire transfers routed through a complex series of offshore holding companies. But the most chilling detail was not the destination of the money, it was the precise timing of the theft. Timestamp 1:14 p.m. Gavin had not drained our accounts while I was walking in the dark. He had not stolen my money after he abandoned me on the highway. He had systematically wiped out my entire financial existence hours before he even suggested taking a romantic drive up the coast. He had smiled at me in our kitchen, kissed my cheek, and helped me pack an overnight bag, all while knowing he had just rendered me entirely destitute. He had somehow bypassed my security protocols, forged my digital authorizations, and emptied my personal safety net. The sheer terrifying magnitude of his premeditation was staggering. He had intended for me to die on that cliff, but he had ensured that even if I somehow miraculously survived the exposure, I would be completely paralyzed. The screen of my phone suddenly went black. The battery had finally died, leaving me staring at my own hollow, exhausted reflection in the dark glass. I sat alone on the cold concrete steps of a house I could no longer enter in a neighborhood where I no longer belonged. I had no money to hire a lawyer, no funds to rent a hotel room, and no resources to even buy a cup of coffee. I was officially penniless. I was officially homeless. Gavin's final sociopathic equation was perfectly balanced. I could not sit on that concrete porch forever. Waiting for pity from my wealthy neighbors was not a survival strategy. I forced my aching body upright, leaving the imposing glass and teak facade of my former life behind. My phone was a useless brick in my pocket, so calling for help was impossible. I began the grueling walk down the steep, winding roads of the Hollywood Hills. The sun climbed higher, beating down on my heavy winter coat, but I kept moving until I reached the busy commercial stretch of Sunset Boulevard. I walked into a diner, ignored the alarmed stares of the morning rush crowd, and begged the manager to let me use their landline to call a cab, promising the fare would be paid upon arrival. 40 minutes later, the taxi pulled up outside a modest 3-story brick apartment complex in Burbank. My younger sister Rachel rushed out of the front gates before the driver even put the car in park. She thrust a handful of cash at the driver and pulled me into a fierce, protective embrace. Derek, her husband, stood just behind her, his face pale with concern. They did not ask a barrage of suffocating questions. They took one look at my dirty, blood-stained clothes, my hollow eyes, and the sheer exhaustion vibrating through my frame, and simply led me inside. They guided me to their small guest room, handed me a glass of water, and shut the door. I collapsed onto the narrow mattress and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. I woke the next morning to the smell of brewing coffee and the muted sounds of morning traffic outside the window. The physical aches had settled deep into my joints, but my mind was entirely sharp. The initial shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, calculating anger. I borrowed a pair of Rachel's sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, walking into their cramped kitchen. Rachel placed a hot mug on the table in front of me. Before I could even take a sip, a sharp, authoritative knock rattled the apartment door. Derek opened it to find a courier in a crisp uniform holding a thick manila envelope. The man asked for me by name, handed over the package, required my signature on his digital pad, and left without another word. The return address, printed in bold, embossed lettering, belonged to one of the most ruthless, high-priced litigation firms in Los Angeles, Brenda's Lawyers. I tore the heavy seal and pulled out a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents. It was a formal, aggressively expedited eviction notice. My forensic training immediately kicked in, scanning past the dense legal jargon to extract the core facts. Gavin had purchased our marital home before we were legally married, keeping the deed entirely in his name. I had contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to the mortgage and the renovations over the years, assuming my financial investments translated to legal equity. I was wrong. The documents explicitly stated that upon Gavin's death, the estate immediately defaulted to his sole surviving biological heir. The heir was currently a 4-month-old fetus residing in Sienna's womb. Brenda had moved with breathtaking speed. She had weaponized her massive wealth to secure emergency injunctions, freezing the estate and declaring me an unlawful trespasser in my own home. The notice demanded I surrender all physical keys and barred me from retrieving any personal property without a court-appointed mediator present. Brenda had promised to leave me with nothing, and she was executing that threat flawlessly. But the eviction was only the first wave of the assault. I needed a secure terminal. I asked Derek to borrow his laptop, bringing it to the kitchen table. My phone was dead, but I remembered my complex master passwords. I logged into my primary email account, intending to contact my own bank and freeze my social security number. The moment my inbox loaded, a torrential flood of automated alerts populated the screen. They were flagged with urgent red priority markers. I opened the first email. It was an overdraft notification from a premium credit card company. I opened the second. It was a final notice from a debt collection agency. My pulse quickened as I clicked through message after message, accessing the attached digital statements. Gavin had not just stolen my private savings, he had actively mined my identity. He had opened 6 different high-yield credit cards, using my name, my credit score, and my social security number. He had bypassed the digital verification processes by routing the physical mail to a secure private post office box I never knew existed. The electronic statements painted a vivid, sickening picture of a man living an extravagant double life. I scrolled through the itemized transactions. There were massive charges for a luxury lease on a beachfront condo in Santa Monica. There were receipts for first-class flights to Paris and Milan. There were exorbitant bills from high-end jewelers, exclusive maternity boutiques, and 5-star resorts. None of these charges were for me. Every single dollar had been spent funding his secret lavish existence with Sienna. He had deliberately leveraged my impeccable credit history to finance his affair, maxing out every single card to its absolute limit. The combined debt totaled over $400,000. I sat back in the wooden kitchen chair, staring at the glowing screen. The scope of his deception was absolute. He had drained my accounts, locked me out of my home, and saddled me with nearly $500,000 of fraudulent debt. He had engineered a scenario where even if I survived his murder attempt, I would be completely ruined. I would spend the next decade fighting in court, bankrupt, homeless, and entirely destroyed, while Sienna and Brenda raised his heir in absolute luxury. Gavin had weaponized every single aspect of our marriage against me. He had treated my life as a ledger, and he had ruthlessly zeroed out my balance. I closed the laptop, the sharp snap of the plastic echoing in the quiet kitchen. I looked up at Rachel and Derek, who were watching me with terrified apprehension. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry. I did not. I felt a dangerous, predatory calm settle deep into my bones. Brenda and Gavin thought they had outsmarted a forensic accountant by hiding the numbers. But numbers always leave a trail, and I was about to follow it right to their doorstep. I turned to Rachel, my voice completely devoid of the panic that had consumed me an hour prior. I asked her to retrieve my everyday leather tote bag from the hallway, the only piece of luggage I had managed to retain throughout the nightmare in Monterey. Hidden beneath the ruined fabric of my blood-stained clothes was a false bottom. I unzipped the concealed lining and pulled out my firm-issued military-grade encrypted laptop. It was a heavy, matte black machine, entirely isolated from our compromised home network. Gavin knew about my job, but his arrogance had always blinded him to the actual scope of my capabilities. He assumed I just balanced corporate ledgers and filed standard compliance reports. He failed to comprehend that I was trained by the top financial institutions in the country to dismantle fraudulent empires brick by digital brick. I booted up the system, bypassed the strict biometric scanner, and initiated a secure routed virtual private network. I needed to bypass the local internet service provider entirely and mask my digital location to prevent any counter-surveillance software Gavin might have installed on our shared accounts from flagging my activity. Derek and Rachel hovered near the kitchen counter, speaking in hushed, frightened tones, completely bewildered by the sudden terrifying shift in my demeanor. I ignored them, my fingers flying across the keys with practiced rhythmic precision. The profound grief that had paralyzed me on the porch was gone, entirely incinerated and replaced by a cold, professional rage. My first target was not his bank accounts. Those were a dead end already manipulated and drained. I went straight for his digital tax footprints, utilizing my licensed practitioner credentials to pull the raw, unfiltered data from the federal and state revenue databases. Gavin had spent our entire marriage projecting the flawless image of a titan in the Los Angeles commercial real estate sector. He wore bespoke Italian suits, drove a leased Aston Martin, and constantly bragged at cocktail parties about his sprawling portfolio of high-yield properties. I began pulling the municipal property deeds he claimed to manage. I ran the specific addresses through the county tax assessor portals and crossed the ownership titles with the state registry. The results were instantaneous and glaring. Gavin did not own a single commercial building outright. Every property was buried beneath thick layers of opaque limited liability companies registered in business-friendly states like Delaware and Wyoming. I initiated a bulk data scrape cross-referencing the registered agents of those shell companies with his known professional associates. The corporate veil he had so carefully constructed began to shred on my screen. I pulled the K-1 tax forms and matched them against the public financing records attached to the physical buildings. The truth was a massive, terrifying financial sinkhole. The properties were leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. There was zero equity. There was no massive incoming cash flow. Instead of generating generational wealth, Gavin was drowning in toxic high-interest mezzanine debt. I opened a blank forensic spreadsheet and began constructing a visual map of his cash flow. I tracked the inbound wire transfers from his prestigious brokerage firm and mapped them against the outbound offshore payments using specific routing numbers I scraped from his deleted email archives. The columns highlighted in red began to multiply rapidly across my screen. I isolated the primary liability accounts, separating the legitimate business expenses from the blatant asset misappropriation. The aggregate total flashed on my monitor, a glowing, undeniable numeric condemnation. $2 million. Gavin was in the red for exactly $2 million. My eyes scanned the transaction dates, searching for the revenue stream that was somehow keeping this sinking ship temporarily afloat. I found it hidden in the operating accounts of a subsidiary management firm he had opened 3 years prior. The incoming capital was not rental income or property appreciation. The deposits were enormous lump sum investments originating directly from his wealthy brokerage clients. He was promising them exclusive access to off-market real estate syndications, guaranteeing them an astronomical quarterly return. But the money was never deployed into property acquisition. He was running a textbook, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme right under the noses of his elite, unsuspecting clientele. I analyzed the disbursement ledger to understand the exact mechanics of his fraud. Gavin was using the fresh capital injected by new investors to pay the promised monthly dividends to the older investors, creating the perfect illusion of a highly profitable exclusive fund. The commingling of funds was a blatant fiduciary breach. But the remaining capital, the massive overflow he was skimming from the top of the incoming wires, was being entirely diverted to fund his extravagant double life with Sienna. The beachfront condo, the designer maternity wear, the offshore accounts he had used to drain my private savings. It was all financed by stolen investor money. The timeline snapped together with devastating crystal clarity. The scheme was not just failing, it was actively imploding. The newest round of investor capital had dried up 2 months ago. The scheduled dividend payouts for his oldest, most aggressive clients were looming, and the subsidiary accounts were completely empty. The $2 million in principal debt was coming due, and the creditors were undoubtedly beginning to ask violent, pressing questions. He was trapped in a financial corner of his own making, facing inevitable federal prison time. That was exactly why he needed to eliminate me. A standard divorce would require a mandatory comprehensive financial disclosure. A judge would immediately order a thorough audit of our joint assets and liabilities. My forensic background meant I would instantly spot the glaring anomalies in his portfolio. He could not afford a legal separation because it would expose his massive federal fraud to the authorities. He needed me dead to trigger the lucrative life insurance policy we had established years ago, providing him with a clean, untraceable influx of cash to temporarily plug the $2 million hole and fund his escape with Sienna. I sat back from the glowing screen, my pulse steady, my breathing perfectly controlled. The devastating betrayal, the eviction notice, the maxed-out secret credit cards, they were all simply symptoms of a much larger catastrophic disease. Gavin was not a successful businessman who had tragically died in a car crash. He was a desperate, cornered criminal who had destroyed countless lives to maintain his pathetic facade. Brenda was currently sitting in my multi-million-dollar marital home, fiercely protecting a legacy that was built entirely on stolen money and federal crimes. She believed she held all the power because she controlled the physical locks. She had absolutely no idea that I now held the digital detonator to her son's entire fraudulent empire, and I was fully prepared to burn it all to the ground. I needed the raw source files. The overarching financial map was clear, but to completely obliterate Gavin's legacy and legally shield myself from the ensuing fallout, I required the granular data. I needed the individual client ledgers, the forged investment prospectuses, and the specific offshore routing protocols he used to funnel the stolen capital. I navigated away from the tax portals and targeted his primary cloud storage architecture. Gavin was arrogant, but he was also obsessively organized. I knew the operational blueprints for his fraud would be archived in a central location. I traced a series of hidden IP addresses to a segmented server. I bypassed the initial firewall using his standard administrative credentials, digging through layers of dummy folders until I found it. A nested directory buried deep within the system, simply labeled with a random string of alphanumeric characters. I double-clicked the icon. A stark black terminal window snapped open. It demanded a complex token-based two-factor authentication code alongside a biometric thumbprint scan. I paused, my hands hovering over the keys. A secondary warning flashed below the prompt stating that 3 failed attempts would trigger a localized self-destruct protocol, permanently wiping the directory. I was locked out, staring at a digital reinforced steel vault. A heavy, warm hand settled onto my right shoulder. I jumped slightly, having completely forgotten that I was sitting in a cramped Burbank kitchen. Derek pulled up a wooden dining chair and sat down beside me. His face was entirely devoid of the panicked confusion he had worn just an hour earlier. His expression had hardened into a mask of intense, calculated focus. Before Derek married my sister, he had spent a decade working as a lead cyber investigator for a federal intelligence agency. He specialized in tracking dark web financial syndicates and dismantling state-sponsored ransomware attacks. He was currently employed in the private sector as a high-level cybersecurity consultant, a man who essentially spent his days thinking like a ghost to protect corporate data. More importantly, Derek was fiercely protective. He had always treated me like a younger sister, and seeing me shivering, bruised, and financially gutted had clearly flipped a very specific dangerous switch in his brain. "Slide over," Derek instructed, his voice low and incredibly steady. I pushed the laptop a few inches to the left. Derek opened his sleek leather work bag resting on the floor and withdrew a thick cable and a small metallic peripheral device. He plugged the device into my secure terminal, his eyes locked on the threatening authentication prompt. He did not ask for a recap. He did not offer useless words of comfort. He simply went to work. He is using a standard rolling token generated by a physical authenticator application on his phone. Derek murmured, his fingers dancing rapidly across the keys. He is dead, so the physical device is likely sitting in a police evidence locker in Monterey. But the verification handshake between this server and the authentication provider leaves a temporary exploitable loop open during the request phase. I watched in silent awe as Derek opened a secondary command window running a packet sniffer to intercept the server traffic. Lines of dense scrolling code reflected in his dark eyes. He was dissecting the digital lock with the precision of a master safecracker. I just need to isolate the active session identifier. Derek explained, his tone conversational as if he were discussing the weather. I am going to spoof the response node, tricking the cloud server into believing the encrypted token request was successfully validated by his physical phone. Hold your breath. He executed a rapid series of commands and hit the return key. The terminal window froze for one agonizing second. Then the harsh red warning text vanished. The screen blinked green. The encrypted wall dissolved entirely, and the hidden drive mounted effortlessly onto the desktop. "We are in," Derek said, leaning back and crossing his arms. I immediately took control of the trackpad, diving into the decrypted archive. It was a treasure trove of perfectly organized malice. The drive was divided into two main partitions. I opened the first, instantly verifying my theories. It contained the complete unredacted financial ledgers of his Ponzi scheme. I found the forged quarterly statements he mailed to his clients and the internal spreadsheets tracking the massive capital deficit. I quickly initiated a secure encrypted download backing up every single gigabyte of his financial fraud to my local drive. Derek pointed to the second partition. "Open the communication logs." I clicked the folder. It contained thousands of exported encrypted messaging transcripts and permanently deleted emails. Gavin had used a secure self-erasing chat application on his phone to communicate with Sienna, but his obsessive need for record-keeping meant he had automatically backed up the transcripts to this hidden server. We began sifting through the text logs, reading the raw, unfiltered coordination of their affair. The messages were not romantic. They were chillingly pragmatic reading, like a corporate merger built on blood. They had been actively planning this for 9 months. I watched the cursor scroll past messages where Sienna meticulously detailed the specific route along the Pacific Coast Highway. She had sent Gavin links to topographical maps of Big Sur, highlighting the sharpest, most deadly drops where guardrails were minimal. The depth of their coordination made my blood run cold. They discussed the specific safety features of our luxury sedan. Sienna had forwarded a technical article explaining how the passenger side airbag deployment sensors could be marginally delayed if the seatbelt mechanism was disengaged milliseconds before an impact. She was the one who suggested the unbuckling tactic. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I read an exchange dated just 3 days ago. Sienna had written a long paragraph mocking my ignorance, celebrating the fact that I was currently packing my bags for a romantic getaway while they finalized the timeline for my execution. She explicitly instructed Gavin to execute the massive bank transfers exactly 1 hour before we departed, guaranteeing the funds would clear offshore before the authorities could freeze our domestic accounts upon discovering my body. They discussed their unborn child, referring to the baby as the ultimate leverage. Sienna outlined the legal strategy Brenda was currently employing, proving that my mother-in-law was not just a reactionary opportunist, but a fully informed participant in the aftermath. They had orchestrated my murder, the theft of my life savings, and my immediate eviction with the cold, calculated precision of a hostile corporate takeover. The sheer depravity laid bare in the digital text was suffocating. They had left absolutely nothing to chance. I stared at the screen, the horrific words burning themselves into my memory. They thought they had buried all the evidence. They thought the ocean would swallow the only witness. I looked over at Derek, whose jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. He met my gaze, his eyes burning with silent protective fury. We had the motive, we had the method, and we had the financial ruin that precipitated the entire plot. I finally had the ammunition required to fire back. The silence in the cramped Burbank kitchen was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, frantic whir of the laptop's cooling fan. We had the chat logs. We had the blueprint of my attempted murder. We had the devastating ledger of a $2 million Ponzi scheme. But as I stared at the glowing monitor, a glaring mathematical discrepancy gnawed at my forensic instincts. The equation remained unbalanced. Gavin had stolen my personal savings, maxed out fraudulent credit cards, and locked me out of the house. That covered the immediate cash flow needed for his affair, but it did not patch the massive $2 million crater sitting in his corporate accounts. Killing me for my $150,000 was akin to using a bucket to stop a tsunami. It was not enough to save him from federal prison. There was a missing variable, a massive influx of capital he was counting on. I relayed this logic to Derek. He did not hesitate. His fingers returned to the keyboard, initiating a deep-level sweep of the decrypted drive's slack space. If Gavin was anticipating a multi-million-dollar payout, there had to be a contract, a guarantee, or a digital paper trail verifying the incoming asset. We abandoned the communication logs and shifted our focus back to the financial directories. Derek ran a parsing script commanding the terminal to isolate any file that utilized a different encryption protocol than the rest of the server. Within seconds, the script pinged a hit. It was a solitary, seemingly innocuous PDF document buried inside a nested folder labeled with a mundane system update title. However, unlike the chat logs and the Ponzi ledgers, this specific file was fortified with an entirely separate military-grade encryption wrapper. Gavin had locked this single document behind a wall thicker than the one protecting his federal crimes. He really did not want anyone finding this. Derek muttered, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the encryption standard. It is a highly advanced cipher. Brute forcing this would take a supercomputer a lifetime. But humans are lazy. They reuse core password structures across platforms. I am going to run a localized dictionary attack using permutations of Sienna's name, the baby's projected due date, and his offshore account routing numbers. Derek initiated the attack. A rapid cascading waterfall of alphanumeric combinations flooded a black terminal window on the left side of the screen. I watched the progress bar inch forward, the tension in the room thickening with every passing second. We sat shoulder to shoulder, the glow of the monitor illuminating the grim determination on Derek's face. 2 minutes dragged by, then 3. The laptop fan roared in protest as the processor maxed out. Suddenly, the cascading text froze. A satisfying metallic chime echoed from the laptop speakers. The password input field dissolved, and the PDF rendered onto the screen in stark, high-definition clarity. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the heavily formatted legal document. The header bore the logo of a premier international underwriting firm based in Geneva. It was not a real estate contract or an offshore banking charter. It was a comprehensive premium life insurance policy. My analytical mind immediately jumped to the execution dates. The policy had been initiated 3 months ago, perfectly aligning with the exact timeframe Sienna had discovered her pregnancy. But it had not been finalized and legally bound until precisely 7 days ago. Exactly 1 week before Gavin enthusiastically suggested we take a romantic, spontaneous drive up the treacherous cliffs of the Pacific Coast Highway. I scrolled down to the coverage details. The words printed on the screen hit me with the force of a physical blow. The insured party was not Gavin, it was me. The principal payout upon the event of my accidental death was exactly $5 million. The missing variable in Gavin's monstrous equation snapped violently into place. The sheer staggering magnitude of the financial motive was laid bare in perfectly formatted, legally binding ink. This was the payout. This was the golden ticket that would save his entire existence. I scrolled further down to the beneficiary designations. The primary beneficiary entitled to receive 100% of the $5 million payout was listed as my loving husband, Gavin. That was standard protocol for a marital policy. But it was the contingent beneficiary, the secondary recipient designated to receive the funds in the event that the primary beneficiary was deceased or incapacitated, that truly showcased the depth of their sociopathic coordination. There, explicitly printed on the official international document, was Sienna's full legal name. Gavin was a meticulous, calculating control freak. He knew that staging a fatal car crash by rolling our luxury sedan off a cliff was an inherently unpredictable endeavor. He had delayed the airbags and instructed me to unbuckle my seatbelt to guarantee my death upon impact. But he was also sitting in the driver's seat. There was a statistical probability that he might not survive the plunge either. By naming Sienna as the secret contingent beneficiary, he guaranteed that even if his murder-suicide plot inadvertently claimed his own life, the $5 million would bypass his estate, bypass my family entirely, and go directly into the hands of his mistress and his unborn heir. The entire horrifying plot was finally perfectly illuminated. Every action, every stolen dollar, every fake smile over the last 9 months led directly to this single multi-million-dollar PDF. Gavin and Sienna had conspired to execute me on that desolate stretch of California coastline. The plan was flawless in its brutal simplicity. They would stage a tragic accident, mourn the loss of a beloved wife, and file the international claim. The $5 million would be wired cleanly into Gavin's accounts. He would immediately use $2 million to quietly pay off his aggressive, defrauded investors, permanently erasing the evidence of his massive Ponzi scheme before the federal authorities even knew to look for it. The remaining $3 million, combined with the liquidation of my personal assets and the sale of our marital home, would fund a life of absolute, untouchable luxury for his new family. I stared at the PDF, my reflection caught in the dark borders of the screen. They had priced my life at exactly $5 million. They had weighed my existence against their financial ruin and decided I was nothing more than an expendable asset to be liquidated for a payout. The shock was entirely gone, now replaced by a cold, crystalline focus that sharpened all of my senses. Derek slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound respect. "You have it all," he said quietly. "You have the motive. You have the proof." I reached out and gently closed the laptop. The forensic accountant had found the missing ledger. Gavin had built his entire future on the absolute certainty of my death. He had severely underestimated the survival instinct of a woman who knew exactly how to trace the numbers. It was time to show my grieving husband exactly what happened when a dead woman decided to audit his life. Derek safely disconnected his hardware from my machine, slipping the metallic peripheral back into his leather bag. We did not need to exchange a single word to agree on our next move. The digital evidence was securely backed up, but to legally shatter the illusion Gavin and Sienna had meticulously built, I needed physical corroboration. I needed to look the devil in the eye and let her make her next catastrophic mistake. We left the cramped Burbank apartment and drove straight to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The Los Angeles traffic was a suffocating, gridlocked crawl, but my pulse maintained a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I was no longer a panicked victim fleeing an attempted murder. I was a forensic auditor hunting them on their own territory. Cedars-Sinai was a labyrinth of sterile white corridors, buzzing monitors, and the sharp scent of clinical antiseptic. Derek utilized his federal background, flashing a silver credential badge to a bewildered nursing station attendant to bypass the standard visitor protocols and locate her specific room. Sienna was not recovering in the general surgical ward. Gavin's stolen investor capital had apparently purchased the absolute best medical care available. She was tucked away in a sprawling private VIP suite on the top floor. It was a room that looked more like a luxury hotel penthouse than a clinical facility, complete with panoramic city views and a private seating area. A massive, ostentatious floral arrangement sat on a mahogany credenza, undoubtedly billed to one of Gavin's fraudulent corporate credit cards. I pushed the heavy oak door open. Sienna was sitting upright in a plush motorized hospital bed, wearing a silk designer robe that clearly belonged in a high-end boutique. Flanking her bedside was Brenda, my mother-in-law, hovering over the mattress like a fiercely protective gargoyle. Brenda immediately stiffened when we walked in, her eyes darting nervously between me and Derek. She opened her mouth, inhaling deeply, ready to unleash a barrage of rehearsed grief-stricken indignation. Derek stepped forward before she could utter a single syllable, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding authority. He smoothly informed Brenda that his firm needed her down at the hospital's administrative desk immediately to verify some highly sensitive legal documentation regarding Gavin's physical estate. Brenda hesitated, casting a protective glance at the bed, but the deliberate mention of securing her son's assets triggered her inherent greed. She smoothed her skirt, shot me a venomous glare, and marched out of the suite. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving the three of us in sudden, absolute silence. The precise second Brenda was gone, the frightened, delicate facade Sienna had projected instantly vanished. Her posture straightened against the pillows, and the manufactured tears completely dried up. A slow, chilling smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. She reached out with her left hand to adjust the collar of her silk robe, deliberately catching the overhead fluorescent light. A massive, flawless, cushion-cut diamond ring rested prominently on her ring finger. It was a ring I recognized instantly, not because it was mine, but because I had seen the specific custom order receipt buried in Gavin's decrypted financial ledger. He had purchased it 2 months ago, using a diverted offshore wire transfer from his Ponzi scheme. She did not look like a woman mourning a tragic, fatal car accident. She looked exactly like a victor preparing to claim her spoils. She sneered, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory gleam. She noted that I was remarkably resilient for someone who was supposed to be resting permanently at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The sheer audacity of her statement confirmed everything. There was zero denial. There was no feigned ignorance. She was openly flaunting her complicity, fully believing she held an unbeatable hand. Derek stood silently by the door, a silent, imposing witness to her unmasking his hand, casually resting near his pocket, where a digital audio device was actively recording every single word she spoke. Sienna leaned over to the bedside table and retrieved a crisp manila envelope. She opened the flap and withdrew a single sheet of heavy stock paper. She held it up, making sure I could clearly see the blue ink sprawling across the page. It was a handwritten document completely covered in Gavin's distinct, aggressive, slanted penmanship. She proudly announced it was a holographic will, a document entirely legal and binding in the state of California without the need for official witnesses. She began reading the clauses aloud, her voice dripping with triumphant, calculated venom. Michi. The disinheritance. In the event of his untimely death, Gavin explicitly revoked all previous testaments and legally disinherited me, his lawful wife citing irreconcilable marital differences and a desire for a clean break. The asset transfer. The handwritten will transferred total, undisputed ownership of his entire estate, his business assets and his corporate holdings directly to her, Ma'am. The ultimate payout. Most importantly, it designated Sienna and their unborn child as the sole beneficiaries of the entirety of the newly established $5 million life insurance policy. She practically purred as she delivered the final blow. She explained that my miraculous survival on the cliff was a minor frustrating inconvenience, but ultimately completely irrelevant. With Gavin dead, the forged narrative they had carefully constructed would easily hold up in probate court. She possessed the physical, legally binding document proving his final wishes. She fully intended to bleed me dry in civil litigation, utilizing the insurance payout to hire a fleet of ruthless attorneys until I was left with absolutely nothing but the blood-stained clothes on my back. She truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect crime, securing generational wealth and erasing me from the board entirely. I stared at the piece of paper in her hand, analyzing the signature, the dates, the specific legal phrasing. To an untrained eye, it looked like a devastating, bulletproof final checkmate. But to a forensic auditor, who had just spent the last 3 hours dissecting the dead man's digital soul, it was the greatest gift she could have possibly handed me. I knew the exact date that handwritten will was drafted. I knew the exact offshore account he had used to buy the diamond she was currently flashing. And I knew that every single asset she so desperately believed she was inheriting was utterly toxic, built on a collapsing foundation of federal wire fraud and non-existent collateral. She was fighting for the throne of an empire that was already $2 million in debt. I did not scream. I did not lunge at her bed. I simply offered her a cold, empty smile, turned on my heel, and walked out of the VIP suite, with Derek right behind me, armed with the final physical piece of the puzzle to trigger their complete annihilation. We walked out of Cedars-Sinai and stepped into the blinding afternoon sun, the digital recording of Sienna's gloating confession, burning a hole in Derek's pocket. For a fleeting 12 hours, I allowed myself to believe the worst of the battle was behind me. We had the decrypted financial ledgers, the $5 million insurance policy, and the audio evidence of her complicity. I spent that evening on Derek and Rachel's cramped Burbank sofa, finally slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep, convinced that the morning would bring swift, undeniable justice. I was catastrophically naive to underestimate the power of a wealthy grieving mother backed into a corner with limitless resources. I woke up to the sound of Rachel's frantic pacing. She was clutching her smartphone, her face drained of all color, chewing nervously on her bottom lip. Before she could utter a single word, my own phone erupted on the coffee table. A rapid, unending series of notification chimes pinged in a chaotic chorus. I picked up the device, squinting at the glowing screen. My email inbox, my text messages, and every single social media platform I maintained were overflowing with hundreds of unread alerts. I opened a notification from a prominent local news aggregator. The headline stared back at me in bold, aggressive font, openly questioning how the grieving widow of a Los Angeles real estate titan had miraculously emerged from a fatal plunge completely unscathed. Brenda had not spent the night mourning her son. She had utilized her extensive country club network and bottomless checking account to hire one of the most ruthless, aggressive crisis management public relations firms on the West Coast. Instead of waiting for the police investigation to conclude, she had launched a preemptive scorched earth smear campaign to control the narrative. The PR firm had immediately weaponized my survival. The articles flooding the internet were masterclasses in character assassination, weaving a few strands of truth into a terrifying, unassailable tapestry of lies. Overnight, I was no longer the tragic victim of a horrific coastal accident. I was painted as an unstable, deeply jealous, financially dependent wife who had grown dangerously paranoid about her highly successful husband. Anonymous sources, undoubtedly paid off by Brenda's fixers, provided fabricated quotes detailing my supposedly explosive temper and history of irrational behavior. The digital tabloids speculated wildly, suggesting that my background in forensic auditing gave me the exact analytical, calculated mindset required to sabotage the brake lines of our luxury sedan. They framed my ability to escape the sinking wreckage not as a desperate, terrifying fight for life, but as the calculated, rehearsed exit of a cold-blooded saboteur who had planned the accident down to the millisecond. The public consumption of the manufactured tragedy was instantaneous and vicious. A polished, wealthy, grieving mother weeping for her golden boy was a far more compelling media narrative than a bruised, exhausted woman hiding out in the San Fernando Valley. True crime bloggers and internet sleuths latched onto the story with predatory zeal, dissecting my wedding photos, scrutinizing my lack of public tears, and flooding comment sections with baseless, violent theories. Within hours, my face was plastered across national digital news networks, labeled as a person of interest by the court of public opinion. The backlash materialized in my inbox as a tidal wave of vitriol. I read messages calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a murderer. Anonymous numbers texted me explicit death threats detailing exactly how I deserved to follow my husband to the bottom of the ocean. The digital assault quickly breached the physical world. By noon, a swarm of freelance paparazzi and aggressive local reporters had somehow discovered Derek and Rachel's address. They camped out on the narrow suburban street, blocking the driveway with news vans thrusting long-lens cameras over the hedges and shouting rapid-fire accusations every time the living room blinds twitched. I was forced to retreat into the windowless interior hallway, sitting on the hardwood floor, with my knees pulled tightly to my chest. I listened to the muffled shouts of journalists demanding I answer for my husband's death. I was effectively under siege, trapped inside a house I did not own, hunted by a public that had already convicted me without a trial. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the final pillar of my previous life was systematically kicked out from under me. My phone vibrated with a call from the human resources director at my prestigious financial firm. I answered, expecting perhaps a modicum of corporate sympathy, or perhaps an offer of discreet legal support from the partners I had generated millions in revenue for. Instead, the director's voice was clipped, heavily rehearsed, and entirely devoid of human warmth. She informed me that the executive board had convened an emergency meeting regarding the viral media storm. While she legally stressed that the firm believed in the presumption of innocence pending a police investigation, she coldly stated that the current optics were severely damaging to their blue-chip corporate partnerships. I was being placed on an indefinite unpaid administrative suspension, effective immediately. My company email was deactivated. While we were still on the phone, my building access badges were revoked and my health insurance benefits were frozen. They were severing all ties, throwing me to the wolves to protect their pristine corporate image and quarterly earnings. I lowered the phone from my ear, the dial tone echoing in the dim hallway. Brenda's strategy was brutally effective. She had not just stolen the narrative, she had entirely isolated me from society. I was stripped of my career, stripped of my reputation, and completely cut off from the outside world. I had the undeniable truth locked on a hard drive, but I was suddenly a global pariah shouting into a void where absolutely no one was willing to listen. The ringing of my phone cut through the suffocating silence of the hallway, a sharp, jarring noise that made me flinch. It was not another blocked number spewing violent death threats or a corporate drone officially terminating my livelihood. The caller ID displayed a Monterey County municipal prefix. I swiped the cracked glass screen, my voice a raspy, hesitant whisper. Detective Ramirez was on the line, his tone entirely stripped of the gentle, sympathetic bedside manner he had so carefully employed at the hospital. He did not ask how I was holding up or inquire about the media circus actively stalking me outside. He delivered a cold, non-negotiable directive. He needed me at the local precinct for a formal recorded interview. He stated it was standard procedure for a fatal traffic incident, but the rigid, clinical cadence of his words suggested something far more ominous was waiting for me. Derek immediately volunteered to drive. We navigated a terrifying gauntlet of flashing camera bulbs and screamed accusations just to reach his car, the paparazzi swarming the vehicle like starving locusts as we aggressively backed out of the driveway. The drive north to the precinct was agonizingly silent. I stared out the passenger window, watching the blur of the California coastline, my mind rapidly calculating the horrific odds stacking against me. Brenda's public relations assassins had successfully painted me as a homicidal, jealous sociopath, and now the actual authorities were summoning me directly into the lion's den. The precinct was a drab, municipal building that smelled heavily of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. A uniformed officer immediately escorted me away from Derek, leading me down a narrow corridor and into a cramped, windowless interrogation room. A heavy metal table bolted firmly to the floor occupied the center of the space, flanked by two painfully uncomfortable metal chairs. The digital red eye of a recording camera blinked steadily from the corner of the acoustic ceiling. Detective Ramirez entered a few moments later, carrying a thick, overflowing manila case file. He sat down heavily across from me, his dark eyes exhausted, studying my face with a piercing, analytical intensity that made my skin crawl. He opened the file and pushed an 8x10 glossy photograph across the scratched metal table. It was a macro-lens image of a severed braided steel line, the edges clean and bright against the rusted, salt-stained undercarriage of a vehicle. Ramirez did not mince words or offer any comforting preamble. He explained that the Marine Salvage Recovery Team had successfully hoisted our ruined luxury sedan from the ocean floor late last night. The county forensic mechanics had spent the entire morning dismantling the crushed wreckage, desperately searching for mechanical failures that could possibly explain a highly experienced driver accelerating off a sheer cliff. They found exactly what they were looking for, but it was not a factory defect or a ruptured hydraulic seal. The master brake lines had been entirely severed. They were not frayed from the violent impact or damaged by the crushing weight of the Pacific Ocean. They had been deliberately surgically sliced with a high-tensile wire cutter prior to the vehicle ever leaving our driveway in Los Angeles. I stared at the photograph, the chilling reality of Gavin's meticulous planning washing over me. He had sabotaged his own vehicle knowing exactly when and where the brakes would ultimately fail, trusting his delayed airbag and unbuckled seatbelt tactic to save his own life while ensuring a lethal plunge for me. But Detective Ramirez was not looking at the photograph. He was looking directly at me, his gaze heavy with profound suspicion. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together, and methodically laid out the prosecution's devastating narrative. From the perspective of the Monterey County Police Department, the facts were glaringly simple. A wealthy, successful real estate executive was dead. His wife, who miraculously escaped the submerged wreckage without a single life-threatening injury, was sitting unharmed in the interrogation room. Ramirez pointed out the undeniable fact that I was the only other living person present on that desolate stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway. He directly referenced the explosive viral articles currently circulating online, explicitly noting the widespread allegations of my intense jealousy and deep marital instability. He revealed that the police had officially subpoenaed our joint financial records that morning and discovered the massive suspicious capital drains. To an outside investigator entirely oblivious to the complex Ponzi scheme and the hidden offshore accounts, the missing money looked exactly like a volatile, escalating marital dispute over drained finances. Ramirez painted a terrifying picture of a desperate, cornered woman who had discovered her husband's secret spending snapped under the immense psychological pressure and methodically cut the brake lines before embarking on a romantic getaway to secure a lethal outcome. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to scream the absolute truth about Sienna, the $5 million insurance policy, and the fraudulent corporate ledgers, but Ramirez sharply cut me off. He demanded an airtight, verifiable alibi for my exact whereabouts during the immediate aftermath of the crash. He wanted a minute-by-minute breakdown of the hours I claimed to have spent walking alone on the highway before the passing trucker finally stopped. I felt a cold knot of genuine, paralyzing terror tighten in my stomach. I had absolutely nothing to offer him. There were no traffic cameras positioned on that remote, jagged section of the cliffs. There were no passing motorists or late-night witnesses who saw me drag my battered body from the freezing surf. For 3 agonizing hours, I was a ghost wandering along the wet asphalt in the dead of night. I had zero physical proof to corroborate my timeline between the moment the car breached the guardrail and the moment I finally arrived at the hospital doors. Ramirez closed the manila folder with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed like a gunshot in the cramped, silent room. His voice dropped to a low, grave warning that sealed my fate. The district attorney was currently reviewing the mechanical sabotage report alongside the highly damaging witness statements provided by Brenda's high-priced legal team. Based entirely on the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, my complete lack of a verifiable alibi, and the clear financial motive provided by the missing marital funds, I was now the prime and only suspect in a first-degree murder investigation. Ramirez stated with chilling, absolute certainty that an official arrest warrant was actively being drafted. I had walked into the precinct desperately believing I was a surviving victim seeking protection from a corrupt, wealthy family, only to discover I was standing on the absolute precipice of a life sentence for a murder I did not commit. The heavy metal door of the precinct clicked shut behind me, sounding like a prison cell slamming closed. I stumbled out into the blinding coastal sunlight, my legs feeling like lead. Derek was waiting by his car, the engine already idling. He took one look at my pale, terrified face and threw the vehicle into drive the second I buckled my seatbelt. We tore away from the municipal building, leaving the swarm of hungry paparazzi choking on our exhaust fumes. The drive back to the cramped Burbank apartment was a suffocating void of silence. panic raw and unadulterated clawed at my throat. I was no longer just fighting a PR smear campaign or a greedy mother-in-law. I was actively racing against a ticking clock, waiting for a squad of uniformed officers to kick down the door and shackle me for first-degree murder. Rachel met us at the threshold the moment we returned, her eyes wide with frantic anticipation. I collapsed onto their worn fabric sofa, burying my face in my trembling hands. I relayed every single agonizing detail of Ramirez's interrogation: the surgically severed brake lines, the completely absent alibi, the official arrest warrant currently sitting on the district attorney's desk awaiting a signature. The walls of the small apartment seemed to actively close in around me, shrinking the room until I could barely draw a full breath. I had survived the freezing Pacific Ocean only to be drowned by the California penal system. Derek did not offer empty platitudes or waste time attempting to soothe my spiraling panic. He simply pivoted away from the sofa, dropped into his desk chair, and cracked his knuckles. While I was trapped in that windowless interrogation room, he had not been idle. He had aggressively shifted his digital hunt, abandoning Gavin's offshore corporate ledgers, to focus entirely on physical geographic data. His glowing dual monitors were completely cluttered with municipal zoning maps, satellite imagery, and local traffic camera feeds covering the affluent Los Angeles neighborhood where Gavin and I had shared our marital home. He was searching for an anomaly, a blind spot, or a digital witness that the local police had entirely overlooked in their rush to secure a convenient conviction. The police theory hinged on a narrative that I had tampered with the vehicle. But Gavin was a creature of habit and immense vanity. If he had crawled under his own luxury sedan with a high-tensile wire cutter to sever his brake lines, he had done it on his own property, entirely secure in his arrogant belief that no one was watching. Derek's fingers danced across his mechanical keyboard in a furious rhythmic blur. He ran a proprietary scrubbing protocol, pulling MAC addresses and local network logs from the immediate vicinity of my former driveway. He was hunting for the digital footprint of any device active during the critical 48-hour window prior to our fatal drive. The terminal windows cascaded with lines of green code, filtering out smartphones, smart televisions, and standard home security systems that faced the wrong direction. Suddenly, Derek hit a firm keystroke, freezing the rapid cascade of data. A sharp, triumphant beep echoed from his desktop speakers. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at a specific isolated data node, blinking steadily on his right monitor. It was a digital ping, originating directly across the street from Gavin's driveway. Derek pulled up a corresponding mapping image of the street, cross-referencing the exact coordinates of the ping. It belonged to a neighbor's vehicle, specifically a late-model Tesla. Derek spun his chair around to face me, the intense blue light of the monitors reflecting off his glasses. He explained the sheer miraculous luck of that specific digital signature. That particular make of vehicle was equipped with an integrated security feature known as Sentry Mode. It utilized an array of high-definition wide-angle exterior cameras originally designed to monitor for vandalism or theft. When activated, the vehicle functioned as an unblinking 24-hour surveillance hub, recording everything in its immediate visual radius. According to the network logs Derek had just intercepted, that specific car had been parked curbside, facing perfectly perpendicular to our garage for the entire night before Gavin cheerfully suggested our romantic coastal drive. If Gavin had knelt on the concrete to slice the hydraulic lines, the unblinking mechanical eyes of the neighbor's car had captured the entire murderous preparation in crystal-clear high-definition video. Rachel gasped, urging him to simply call the neighbor and demand the footage. Derek shook his head instantly, dismissing the idea as entirely too risky. The media had already branded me a volatile, calculating killer. If a stranger suspected we were hunting for evidence, they might panic contact the authorities, or worse, delete the files entirely out of a misplaced sense of civic duty. We could not rely on the unpredictable nature of a frightened civilian. Derek had to extract the video silently, leaving absolutely no digital fingerprints behind. He initiated a highly complex backdoor infiltration protocol. Sentry Mode footage was automatically uploaded and stored on heavily fortified encrypted cloud servers. Breaking into that specific vault required bypassing military-grade security measures without triggering an automated alarm that would lock down the entire account. I watched in a state of suspended animation as Derek deployed a sequence of masking proxies, bouncing his connection through servers in Eastern Europe and South America to obscure our physical location in Burbank. The apartment was dead silent, save for the frantic clicking of his keyboard and the low hum of the processor tower working overtime. He deployed a targeted decryption script, forcefully prying open the neighbor's cloud directory to locate the specific heavy video files time-stamped for that crucial night. A progress bar materialized in the center of the screen, indicating that the extraction had successfully commenced. However, the sheer volume of the high-definition video data combined with the extreme density of the cloud encryption meant this was not going to be instantaneous. The rendering bar inched forward at a painfully sluggish pace. Derek leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, ragged breath. He dragged his hands down his face, the exhaustion of the past 3 days finally showing in the harsh monitor light. He looked at the estimated time to completion hovering near the bottom of the window. It would take roughly 4 grueling hours to fully extract, decode, and render the raw video files. We were trapped in a terrifying high-stakes waiting game. The physical proof of my innocence and Gavin's monstrous guilt was currently downloading byte by excruciating byte. But across the state in a sterile municipal building, Detective Ramirez was methodically finalizing the paperwork to throw me in a concrete cell. I pulled my knees tight to my chest, my eyes locked on the agonizingly slow progress bar, praying that the digital truth would render before the police kicked the apartment door off its hinges. The agonizing wait was abruptly shattered not by the splintering of wood and a police raid, but by the sharp, piercing chime of an incoming email on my phone. The notification cut through the heavy silence of the Burbank apartment like a siren. I scrambled to retrieve the device from the coffee table, my eyes scanning the sender address. It was an automated alert forwarded by the administrative assistant at the estate planning firm Gavin and I had retained years ago. The subject line was stamped with a red high-priority flag from the Los Angeles County Superior Court. I opened the encrypted attachment, my heart hammering against my ribs as I rapidly processed the dense legal jargon. Brenda and Sienna had not paused to rest. Armed with the fraudulent holographic will and a team of aggressively ruthless corporate litigators, they had successfully filed an ex parte motion for an emergency probate hearing. They cited exigent circumstances and the immediate necessity to secure Gavin's volatile business assets to bypass the standard judicial waiting periods. The court clerk had approved the expedited request. The formal hearing was scheduled for exactly 48 hours from now. The strategy was a brilliantly orchestrated, inescapable trap. If I failed to appear at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, I would legally default. The presiding judge would immediately ratify the handwritten will, officially transferring absolute control of Gavin's entire corporate empire, the remaining marital assets, and the $5 million insurance policy directly to Sienna. I would be permanently stripped of everything I owned, left entirely destitute and powerless to mount a civil defense. However, if I did walk through those heavy mahogany courthouse doors to contest the forgery, Detective Ramirez would undoubtedly be waiting for me. Brenda's attorneys would have undoubtedly alerted the police to my guaranteed arrival. Ramirez did not need to waste municipal resources hunting me down across the sprawling expanse of Southern California. He just had to wait for the 48-hour clock to expire, slap the handcuffs on my wrists the second I stepped into the courthouse lobby, and let Sienna walk away with generational wealth while I was booked for first-degree murder. I relayed the grim reality of the ticking clock to Derek and Rachel. The atmosphere in the living room instantly shifted from suffocating panic to a cold, militaristic focus. We had exactly 2 days to build an impenetrable physical defense that would entirely dismantle the prosecution's narrative before the gavel struck. Derek stared at his primary monitor. The initial cloud extraction of the neighbor's Tesla footage had finally completed, but a massive technical hurdle stood in our way. The raw data package was heavily corrupted by the forceful extraction method and completely encoded in a proprietary dynamic visual codec. The video files were a scrambled, unreadable mess of distorted pixels and shattered audio tracks. Derek announced that he needed to manually rebuild the digital architecture of the file sequence frame by excruciating frame to isolate the exact timestamp of Gavin's sabotage. It was no longer a simple download, it was a brutal, sustained, cryptographic war. He grabbed a handful of energy drinks from the kitchen counter, slipped a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones over his ears, and physically barricaded himself inside his makeshift server closet. He instructed us that under absolutely no circumstances was he to be interrupted. I was entirely incapable of sitting idle while the clock mercilessly counted down my remaining hours of freedom. The adrenaline flooding my nervous system demanded a target. While Derek fought a digital battle to secure my alibi, I needed to locate the ultimate prize. The $5 million insurance payout provided the motive for my murder, but it did not explain the initial crime. Gavin had brazenly defrauded his aggressive, dangerous investors out of $2 million long before he ever orchestrated the cliffside crash. That massive influx of stolen capital had to be parked somewhere waiting to be integrated back into his new life. I needed to follow the ghost money. Rachel wordlessly handed me her sleek silver notebook computer and a fresh pot of black coffee. I linked the device to Derek's secure local network and dove straight back into the decrypted financial ledgers we had liberated from Gavin's hidden drive. I isolated the primary corporate operating accounts and began tracing the exact outflow of the vanished investor capital. Gavin had utilized standard, albeit highly effective, diversion tactics. The money did not disappear in a single massive wire transfer that would immediately trigger federal banking alerts. Instead, it was systematically atomized. I tracked hundreds of fraudulent invoices for phantom construction materials and bogus consulting fees. The capital was fractured into dozens of smaller innocuous payments and routed to a complex web of ghost limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. I spent the next 10 hours painstakingly mapping the digital breadcrumbs, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the screen, my fingers flying across the trackpad as I unraveled the layers of his deceit. By the time the sun began to rise over the San Fernando Valley, I had successfully connected the domestic shell companies. They were not independent entities. They were digital funnels. Every single fractured payment was meticulously routed through a series of automated clearinghouses before being consolidated into a singular centralized holding account based in the Cayman Islands. I did not stop to rest. I pulled the SWIFT codes associated with the Caribbean holding account and initiated a secondary trace. Once the $2 million reached the Caymans, it was aggressively laundered through a rapid succession of high-yield currency swaps bouncing between the euro and the Swiss franc to effectively wash the origin of the funds. Gavin was a meticulous planner, but he lacked the endurance of a trained forensic accountant. He had reused a specific fractional routing sequence during the currency swaps. I locked onto that mathematical fingerprint and followed the money as it was bundled back together and wired out of the offshore registry. The final destination materialized on my screen just as the 24-hour mark approached. The stolen $2 million had settled into a highly secure private wealth management trust based in Zurich. I pulled the foundational documents for the Swiss trust, cross-referencing the establishment dates. The trust had been legally incorporated and fully funded exactly 3 days after Sienna had informed Gavin of her pregnancy. The sheer breathtaking scope of his sociopathic greed was finally laid bare. Gavin had never intended to use the stolen investor capital to save his failing real estate firm. He had deliberately hollowed out his own company, fully intending to let his aggressive creditors tear apart his empty domestic estate after his fabricated death. He had actively hidden the $2 million in an untouchable European vault to serve as the foundational wealth for his new secret family. Combined with the $5 million insurance payout he expected Sienna to collect upon my murder, they had secured an untouchable $7 million empire built entirely on blood and federal fraud. The 48-hour deadline was rapidly approaching. But I was now armed with the complete, undeniable financial map of their conspiracy. Yet a map alone was merely a blueprint. It was entirely circumstantial, without a verified, legally binding name attached to the offshore vehicle. The Zurich Trust was a dead end for establishing immediate liability because Swiss banking laws required a federal subpoena to breach a document I could never obtain while actively dodging a homicide warrant. I needed to pivot my attack. I shifted my focus back to the Cayman Islands holding company that had served as the primary laundering funnel before the capital vanished into Europe. Offshore tax havens sold absolute anonymity, but Gavin had left the back door wide open on his encrypted drive. I scoured his saved administrative directories, hunting for the specific custodial communications required to maintain a Caribbean shell corporation. It took nearly 2 grueling hours of cross-referencing digital certificates and parsing through scanned legal PDFs before I struck the motherlode. It was a digital copy of the original Articles of Incorporation buried deep within a nested folder labeled with a generic alphanumeric string. I zoomed in on the foundational signature line, my pulse quickening against my throat. The primary beneficiary and sole managing director of the offshore entity was not Gavin. It was Sienna. She was not merely an ignorant bystander or a naive, starry-eyed mistress swept up in a tragic romance. She was the active legal custodian of the stolen millions. Her signature, flourishing and arrogant in blue ink, proved she was a fully complicit architect in the financial fraud. Gavin had weaponized her clean criminal record to shield the money, setting her up as the undisputed queen of their illicit empire long before my brakes were ever cut. I sat back, the harsh glare of Rachel's laptop illuminating the dark, silent apartment. Derek was still barricaded inside his closet, fighting the corrupted Tesla video files, leaving me alone with the devastating truth. The prosecution's entire narrative, built by Detective Ramirez and fueled by Brenda's media assassins, rested on the assumption that Gavin had embezzled client capital, panicked, and that I had killed him in a rage over our impending ruin. But a glaring, dangerous anomaly suddenly gnawed at the back of my exhausted mind. If Gavin had successfully liquidated $2 million from his real estate firm to secure his escape, why were his institutional investors still actively sending violent death threats to my phone? If he had already drained their accounts, they would have initiated federal litigation immediately upon discovering the missing funds, not sent anonymous thugs to intimidate a grieving widow. The math simply did not add up. The timeline of the hostility was entirely wrong. I cracked my neck, drained the last bitter dregs of cold coffee from my mug, and dove back into the terminal. I had to execute a masterclass in forensic accounting, auditing the entire theft in reverse. I ignored the Caribbean endpoints and dragged my cursor all the way back to the absolute genesis of the crime. I needed to pinpoint the exact moment the $2 million entered Gavin's fraudulent construction LLCs before it was shattered into 1,000 untraceable pieces. I pulled up the primary domestic wire transfer logs, aggressively peeling back the layers of falsified vendor payments. The initial injection of capital had occurred on a Tuesday exactly 4 months ago, transferred in 3 massive, staggered installments. I highlighted the routing number of the originating institution. It did not belong to the commercial bank where Gavin held his corporate escrow accounts. It was an entirely different financial entity, one that dealt exclusively with legacy wealth management and institutional retirement portfolios. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I ran a reverse lookup on the originating account's routing prefix. The data returned an immediate hit for a highly exclusive private wealth management firm based in Beverly Hills. I cross-referenced the specific internal account digits with the massive cache of personal financial records Gavin had hoarded on his drive. I scrolled rapidly past our joint checking accounts, past his maxed-out platinum credit cards, and past the underwater mortgage documents for the cliffside house. I hit a subfolder dedicated strictly to estate planning. I opened a document titled with a series of dates, and my breath hitched painfully in my chest. The account numbers matched perfectly. The stolen $2 million had absolutely nothing to do with Gavin's angry real estate clients. He had never touched their investments. The money had been systematically, ruthlessly drained from a supposedly untouchable family trust. It was Brenda's private company pension and her fully matured retirement accounts. Gavin had quietly requested power of attorney over his mother's estate under the guise of optimizing her tax burdens and managing her legacy wealth. Instead, he had hollowed out her entire life savings. He had executed fractional liquidations over the course of a week, forging her consent forms to bypass the standard holding periods. He had stolen his own mother's financial future, laundering her retirement fund through Caribbean shell companies directly into his pregnant mistress's hands. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the betrayal left me momentarily paralyzed. Gavin had emptied the accounts of the one woman who believed he was a flawless, martyred saint. Brenda was currently spending a fortune on high-priced corporate litigators, fiercely preparing to destroy me in a formal probate hearing in less than 48 hours, completely oblivious to the fact that her beloved son had already robbed her blind. She was fighting tooth and nail to hand over control of Gavin's estate to Sienna, fighting to enrich the very woman who was currently holding her stolen pension in a secure Swiss vault. Gavin had weaponized his mother's fierce, blind loyalty, knowing she would utilize every ounce of her remaining influence and wealth to blame me for his death, all while he secured her stolen pension for his new family. The missing marital funds that Detective Ramirez believed were my motive for murder were actually a brilliantly orchestrated smokescreen, a distraction from the ultimate unforgivable theft. I now possessed the exact weapon I needed to tear Brenda's crusade to shreds and obliterate the prosecution's entire motive. I just needed Derek to emerge from that closet with the video that would prove I never touched those brakes. The glow of the Swiss banking records was still burning into my retinas when a sharp, violent crash echoed from the short hallway. The heavy wooden door to Derek's makeshift server closet was forcefully kicked open, rebounding off the drywall with a jarring thud. Rachel gasped, spilling a few drops of hot coffee onto the carpet as we both whipped our heads around. Derek stood in the doorframe, his noise-canceling headphones dangling limply around his neck. He did not look triumphant. He looked completely drained of blood, his skin a sickly pallid gray under the harsh fluorescent hallway bulb. His hands were visibly trembling as he gripped the doorframe, steadying himself. He did not say a single word about the encryption protocols or the grueling hours he had just spent battling the corrupted codec. He simply locked eyes with me, his voice a hoarse, hollow rasp, and commanded Rachel and me to get inside the room immediately. I left the offshore financial data illuminating the laptop screen and hurried into the cramped, overheated space. The small room smelled fiercely of ozone and stale energy drinks. Derek's primary monitor was dominating the space, displaying the proprietary media player he had utilized to painstakingly reconstruct the shattered data files. He dropped heavily into his rolling chair and gestured toward the screen. He warned us that the raw file was entirely devoid of audio, stripped of sound, during the forceful extraction process, but the visual feed was immaculate. He reached forward with a shaking finger and tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, dominated by the crisp, high-contrast monochromatic green tint of military-grade night vision. The Sentry Mode cameras of the neighbor's parked Tesla provided a pristine, unobstructed, wide-angle view of my former Los Angeles driveway. The digital timestamp glowing in the bottom right corner confirmed the exact date and hour. It was 2:14 a.m. on the Tuesday preceding our fatal weekend getaway. The street was desolate, bathed in the artificial glow of municipal street lamps. Gavin's luxury SUV sat parked on the concrete incline, gleaming even in the infrared spectrum. For the first 30 seconds, the footage remained perfectly still, a static portrait of affluent suburban tranquility. Then a shadow detached itself from the manicured hedges lining the edge of our property. A figure stepped cautiously onto the concrete. They were dressed entirely in dark, form-fitting athletic wear, their face and head completely swallowed by the oversized hood of a heavy black sweatshirt. The intruder moved with a fluid, terrifyingly deliberate purpose, demonstrating absolutely no hesitation or unfamiliarity with the layout of our home. They did not approach the front door or glance toward the security cameras mounted on our porch. They dropped to their knees the moment they reached the rear bumper of Gavin's vehicle. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath hitching in my throat as the hooded figure slid effortlessly onto their back and shimmied beneath the heavy steel undercarriage of the SUV. The wide-angle lens captured the faint metallic glint of a heavy-duty tool, a pair of high-tensile wire cutters clutched firmly in their gloved right hand. Rachel let out a muffled whimper, her fingers digging painfully into my shoulder. We were watching an execution being methodically prepared in absolute silence. The figure remained submerged beneath the vehicle for exactly 4 agonizing minutes. I knew exactly what they were doing in the dark. They were surgically slicing the hydraulic brake lines, ensuring the failure would not be immediate, but would inevitably occur under the extreme stress of a sustained high-speed drive. The shadow finally slithered out from beneath the chassis. They stood up, wiping grease and road dirt onto the thighs of their dark athletic pants. The physical exertion of the sabotage in the humid California night had clearly taken a toll. The intruder reached up with both gloved hands, gripped the heavy fabric of their hood, and forcefully pulled it back to breathe, tilting their head upwards to catch the cool coastal breeze. In doing so, they looked directly into the unblinking high-definition lens of the Tesla's security camera. The monochromatic green light perfectly illuminated their features. It was not Gavin. It was not a hired thug sent by defrauded, angry real estate investors. It was the flawless, aristocratic face of the woman who had just filed a fraudulent holographic will in probate court. It was Sienna. I stared at the frozen frame, the digital rendering of her face etching itself permanently into my mind. The absolute undeniable proof of my innocence was staring right back at me. The police theory was wrong. The media smear campaign was wrong. Even my own terrifying assumption about Gavin's calculated murder-suicide pact was entirely wrong. Gavin had not crawled under his own car to orchestrate a spectacular staged accident. He had been completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb resting in his driveway. The catastrophic, devastating irony of the situation hit me with the force of a freight train as the timeline clicked into place. Sienna had crept onto my property in the dead of night with a pair of wire cutters, intending to sever the brake lines to eliminate the only obstacles standing between her and a $7 million empire. She had calculated the sabotage perfectly, knowing the car would be utilized later that week. Her master plan was glaringly obvious in its brutal simplicity. She had severed the lines intending for me to drive the SUV home alone from the cliff after Gavin supposedly flew out early for a fabricated business meeting. But her meticulous assassination attempt had been derailed by Gavin's massive ego. She could never have predicted the chaotic near-miss that occurred the very next day. Unbeknownst to me, Gavin had spontaneously changed the plan, driving the rigged car himself with Sienna in the passenger seat for a secret mid-week rendezvous across town. They had unknowingly driven a death trap, surviving that afternoon purely by blind luck because the surgically sliced lines had not fully bled out the hydraulic fluid yet. Sienna had sat in the passenger seat, smiling at her lover, entirely unaware that the brakes she had destroyed the night before were slowly failing beneath their feet. They survived that illicit drive, leaving the final fatal mechanical failure for our weekend trip. Sienna had meticulously sharpened a guillotine meant exclusively for my neck, only for the man she was conspiring with to blindly place his own head on the chopping block. She had murdered her golden goose by accident, and now she was desperately trying to frame me to cover her tracks and claim the spoils. Derek hit the spacebar again, pausing the video feed on Sienna's exposed, heavily breathing face. We finally possessed the ultimate weapon. Ramirez's entire case rested on circumstantial financial motives and a lack of an alibi. But this silent monochromatic file did not just clear my name. It actively indicted the woman actively trying to steal my life. We had the irrefutable evidence of her sabotage. Now we just had to survive long enough to drag her into the light. We barely slept during the 48 hours that followed Derek's miraculous decryption of the Sentry Mode footage. The ticking clock had dissolved into a frantic, sleepless sprint of legal preparation and strategic maneuvering. I had retained a bulldog of a probate litigator named Marcus, a man who possessed a reputation for aggressively dismantling fraudulent estate claims and untangling complex financial webs. Derek had carefully transferred the purified high-definition video file onto a secure encrypted flash drive, while I printed out every single page of the offshore banking logs, highlighting Sienna's signature on the Cayman Island Incorporation documents. Armed with the absolute truth, we drove into downtown Los Angeles to face the executioners. The sprawling, brutalist architecture of the Los Angeles County Courthouse loomed over the city like a towering concrete fortress. Stepping through the heavy glass doors and navigating the chaotic, echoing security checkpoints felt akin to walking toward a firing squad. My heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors as Marcus and I made our way down the long, sterile corridor toward Department 11. My stomach churned with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and primal dread. I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of those heavy mahogany double doors. The courtroom was already packed to absolute capacity, the air thick with an oppressive, stifling tension. Brenda had meticulously engineered the environment, packing the wooden gallery benches with sympathetic society friends, extended family members, and Gavin's former business associates. It was a carefully curated audience designed to exert maximum social pressure on the proceedings. But my eyes immediately bypassed the crowd of hostile onlookers and locked onto a solitary figure seated conspicuously at the end of the second row. Detective Ramirez was waiting. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his posture rigid and unnervingly alert. He did not possess the casual, relaxed demeanor of an interested spectator. He looked like a predator silently observing its prey. His dark eyes locked onto mine the exact moment I crossed the threshold, his gaze heavy with an unspoken, terrifying promise. He was simply biding his time, allowing the civil probate procedure to play out before he stepped forward to execute the first-degree murder warrant currently resting in his breast pocket. He fully expected me to leave this municipal building in handcuffs. I forced myself to look away from the detective and turned my attention to the petitioner's table across the aisle. Brenda sat perfectly erect, clad in an immaculate tailored black morning suit that looked more like battle armor than a genuine expression of grief. But it was the woman positioned directly beside her who truly commanded the room. Sienna had orchestrated a masterful, stomach-churning theatrical performance. She was not seated in one of the standard heavy wooden chairs provided by the court. Instead, she occupied a bulky medical-grade wheelchair positioned prominently in the center aisle for maximum visibility. She wore a thick, restrictive cervical collar strapped tightly around her neck, and her left arm was encased in a heavy synthetic cast resting in a dark fabric sling. A delicate pale knit blanket was draped carefully over her lap, drawing immediate sympathetic attention to her pregnant belly. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her uninjured hand, periodically dabbing at eyes that were rimmed with perfectly applied waterproof redness. The sheer staggering audacity of her performance made the blood roar in my ears. The woman who had crept onto my driveway in the dead of night to orchestrate a lethal mechanical failure was now sitting before a superior court judge, actively playing the fragile, traumatized survivor of her own botched assassination attempt. The bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Aris, a stern, no-nonsense magistrate, with a reputation for strict procedural adherence. The moment the gavel struck the wooden block, Brenda's lead litigator leapt to his feet. He was a slick, silver-haired corporate shark named Sterling, a man who clearly understood that courtroom victories relied just as heavily on emotional manipulation as they did on legal precedent. Sterling did not waste a single second. He immediately launched into a devastating, highly dramatized monologue, detailing the tragic, untimely death of a beloved local businessman. He painted a vivid, completely fabricated picture of Gavin as a desperate, terrified man, trapped in a volatile, financially ruinous marriage, actively seeking to protect his unborn child from a jealous and dangerously unstable spouse. With a dramatic flourish, Sterling formally submitted the fraudulent holographic will to the court clerk, treating the hastily scribbled forged document like a sacred, indisputable testament of Gavin's final wishes. He aggressively petitioned the court to bypass the standard authentication protocols and mandatory waiting periods, citing extreme exigent circumstances. Sterling vehemently argued that Sienna's mounting medical bills from the horrifying crash, combined with the imminent arrival of Gavin's sole biological heir, necessitated the immediate unrestricted release of the $5 million life insurance payout directly into a trust managed jointly by Sienna and Brenda. Then the silver-haired attorney executed a ruthless, calculated pivot, crossing the boundary from civil probate litigation directly into criminal accusation. He turned away from the judge and pointed a manicured finger squarely at my table. Sterling's voice boomed, echoing off the high acoustic ceiling, as he publicly summarized the severed master brake lines and my miraculous, entirely uninjured survival from a crash that had plunged a heavy vehicle into the crushing depths of the Pacific Ocean. He turned toward the gallery, making direct, deliberate eye contact with the homicide detective. "Your Honor," Sterling declared, his voice trembling with manufactured righteous indignation, "we are not merely asking this court for the execution of a deceased man's final desperate wishes. We are begging this court to prevent a violent criminal from profiting off her horrific actions. Detective Ramirez is present in this very room today, possessing the mechanical evidence of deliberate vehicular sabotage. The petitioner demands that the court instantly ratify this document, release the necessary funds to this grieving expectant mother, and allow the authorities to take this woman into custody before she can flee the jurisdiction." The entire courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. The weight of the room was entirely suffocating, every single eye boring into me with absolute revulsion and judgment. Brenda was openly sobbing now, burying her face in a silk handkerchief, while Sienna let out a small, perfectly timed gasp, leaning her head against her mother-in-law's shoulder in a flawless display of fragile dependency. They had meticulously stacked the deck, expertly transforming a mundane financial hearing into a public execution. The walls felt like they were actively closing in the air, growing thin as the full, terrifying scope of their trap closed its jaws tightly around me. Judge Eris peered over the rim of her reading glasses, the heavy mahogany gavel resting near her knuckles, as the echoes of Sterling's theatrical accusations faded into the high vaulted ceiling. The magistrate did not immediately summon the bailiff. She turned her steely gaze toward our table, waiting for a response to the devastating public execution that had just been orchestrated. Marcus stood up. He did not mirror Sterling's fiery, righteous indignation. He did not raise his voice, bang his fists on the table, or offer a passionate defense of my character. He simply buttoned his suit jacket with a chillingly calm, deliberate precision. He addressed the court in a flat, conversational tone, formally requesting permission to submit an emergency evidentiary exhibit that directly contradicted the petitioner's timeline, and he requested to call me to the stand for immediate authentication. Sterling instantly objected, sputtering about procedural violations and ambush tactics, but Judge Eris silenced him with a single sharp strike of her gavel. She granted the request. I stood up from the defense table. I did not look at Brenda, who was glaring at me with unadulterated venom, nor did I look at Sienna, who was still dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. I kept my posture rigidly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of cold, calculated professionalism. I refused to shed a single tear. I refused to display an ounce of fear. I walked the short distance to the witness box, placed my hand on the leather-bound Bible, swore the oath, and took my seat. The microphone hummed faintly as I leaned forward. Marcus approached the stand. He asked me to identify the source of the digital media I had brought into the courtroom. I answered clearly and concisely, stating for the permanent legal record that the files were extracted directly from a neighboring surveillance system, establishing a verified time-stamped visual record of my driveway on the night preceding the fatal crash. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and withdrew 2 identical encrypted silver flash drives. I handed the first drive to the approaching bailiff to be logged into evidence and passed to the judge. I then looked past Marcus, past the polished wooden tables, and locked eyes with the homicide detective seated in the gallery. I instructed Marcus to deliver the secondary drive directly to Detective Ramirez. The courtroom murmured in confusion as my attorney walked down the center aisle and handed the silver stick over the wooden railing. Ramirez accepted the drive, his dark, predatory eyes narrowing in profound suspicion as he stared back at me. Marcus turned to the clerk and requested that the primary evidentiary file be projected onto the courtroom monitors. The large, high-definition screens mounted on the walls flickered to life. The overhead lights were dimmed. A suffocating, absolute silence fell over the sprawling room as the crisp, monochromatic green glow of military-grade night vision illuminated the space. Everyone in the gallery, from the judge on her elevated bench to the hostile society, friends in the back row, watched the silent infrared footage of my driveway. They watched the timestamp glowing in the corner confirming it was 2:14 a.m. They watched the dark hooded figure detach from the manicured hedges and slide effortlessly beneath the chassis of Gavin's parked luxury SUV. The high-resolution lens captured the unmistakable metallic glint of the heavy-duty wire cutters. For 4 agonizing minutes, the entire courtroom watched a premeditated mechanical execution being methodically prepared in the dark. Sterling had stopped writing on his legal pad. Brenda had lowered her silk handkerchief, her jaw slightly slack. On the screen, the shadow finally slithered out from beneath the heavy steel undercarriage. The figure stood up, brushing road dirt from their dark athletic pants. Then the intruder reached up with both gloved hands and forcefully pulled back the heavy fabric hood to breathe. The figure tilted their head upwards, looking directly into the unblinking lens of the security camera. The flawless, aristocratic features of Sienna filled every monitor in the courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, paralyzed vacuum devoid of a single breath or whispered comment. The irrefutable digital truth hung suspended in the air, instantly vaporizing the prosecution's entire fabricated narrative. I looked down from the witness stand, shifting my gaze directly to the wheelchair parked in the center aisle. Sienna's smug, grieving facade had shattered into a portrait of absolute primal horror. The blood had completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly white. Her mouth was open in a silent scream of sheer panic. She instinctively shrank back against the leather upholstery of the medical chair, her eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped rat seeking an impossible exit. Her flawless performance was dead. Before Sterling could even attempt to open his mouth to formulate an objection, the sharp metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoed from the gallery. Detective Ramirez did not wait for the civil proceeding to formally conclude. He did not ask the judge for permission. The veteran homicide detective stepped aggressively into the center aisle, his dark suit cutting through the paralyzed crowd. He bypassed my table entirely. He marched straight toward the petitioner's side. His eyes locked onto the woman in the wheelchair with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. Sienna let out a genuine high-pitched shriek of terror as Ramirez closed the distance. She instinctively raised her allegedly injured left arm, the one entirely encased in the heavy synthetic cast to shield her face. Ramirez did not care about her theatrical props. He reached down, grabbed her by the fabric of the dark sling, and hauled her forcefully upward. The heavy medical wheelchair tipped backward, crashing onto the carpet as Sienna was dragged to her feet. The thick cervical collar around her neck looked utterly ridiculous as she thrashed and kicked against the detective's iron grip. Ramirez swiftly spun her around, forcing her uninjured arms behind her back. The steel cuffs snapped brutally around her wrists, locking her in place. His voice boomed through the shocked silence of the courtroom, completely overriding the civil nature of the hearing. He did not read her rights for a simple financial fraud. He announced the charges with a cold, ringing finality that carried to every corner of the room. He was arresting her for the premeditated attempted murder of Blair and for the resulting mechanical manslaughter of Gavin. The Los Angeles County courtroom absolutely erupted. The sterile, disciplined environment instantly dissolved into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Brenda let out a guttural, agonizing scream, collapsing forward onto the polished wooden table as the reality of her son's true killer crushed her. Sterling immediately took 3 rapid steps backward, physically distancing himself from his newly arrested client, throwing his hands up in a gesture of absolute legal surrender. The gallery exploded into a cacophony of shouts, gasps, and frantic whispers, the curated audience turning instantly against the woman they had come to support. Judge Aris began hammering her gavel against the sounding block, with furious intensity, demanding order that would not come. I sat perfectly still in the witness box, watching Ramirez physically march the thrashing, sobbing architect of my nightmare toward the heavy mahogany doors, finally exhaling the breath I had been holding for days. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a resounding thud, cutting off Sienna's hysterical, fading shrieks. The courtroom remained suspended in a paralyzed, vibrating vacuum. The gallery was utterly mute, stunned by the shocking swiftness of the homicide arrest and the brutal unmasking of the grieving widow. Then a sharp, ragged sound punctured the heavy silence. It was a laugh. Brenda was laughing. The sound began as a breathless, disbelieving gasp and quickly escalated into a manic, echoing cackle. She straightened her posture, smoothing the lapels of her immaculate black morning suit with trembling, manicured fingers. She turned toward the closed doors and began to openly mock the woman who had just been hauled away in steel cuffs. Brenda gloated, her voice dripping with venomous triumph, calling Sienna a pathetic, greedy little tramp who had flown far too close to the sun. She boasted to the silent gallery that the gold digger had failed. Gavin's legacy, she proudly proclaimed, remained completely safe. The bloodline's wealth was untouched, resting securely in Brenda's capable hands. She then turned her fierce, burning gaze toward the witness box. Her lip curled into a triumphant sneer. She believed she still held the ultimate high ground. I might have dodged a murder conviction, she spat, but she still controlled the sprawling estate, the financial empire, and the legal power to bury me in civil litigation for the rest of my natural life. I remained seated in the wooden witness box. I did not flinch at her poisonous arrogance. I looked down at Marcus, who gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation. I turned my attention back to Judge Aris, my voice ringing clear, cold, and authoritative through the high acoustic ceiling of Department 11. I informed the magistrate that the matter of the $5 million life insurance policy was merely a fraction of the conspiracy currently before the court. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a thick, heavily bound stack of printed financial dossiers. These were the complete Cayman Island ledgers. Marcus approached the bench, handing the towering stack of documents up to the court clerk. I addressed Brenda directly, locking my eyes onto her triumphant, tear-stained face. I systematically laid out the exact, undisputed timeline of Gavin's initial embezzlement. I watched Brenda's confident sneer slowly curdle into confusion as I detailed the domestic shell companies, the fraudulent vendor invoices, the rapid fractional transfers, and the aggressive euro and Swiss franc currency swaps. I explained to the captivated courtroom that Gavin required $2 million in untraceable liquid capital to fund his secret, luxurious offshore life with his pregnant mistress. Brenda interrupted, her voice shrill and desperate, practically screaming that my husband had stolen from his aggressive corporate clients, that his business was failing. I shook my head slowly, delivering the cold, undeniable, and fatal truth. He did not steal from his clients. He had bypassed his commercial escrow accounts entirely. I recited the specific routing prefix of the Beverly Hills wealth management firm, the exact mathematical fingerprint I had traced through the Caribbean funnels. I watched the color instantly drain from Brenda's face, her skin turning the color of wet ash. I stated for the permanent legal record that Gavin had deliberately, ruthlessly hollowed out his own mother's fully matured retirement accounts and her private company pension. I did not spare her a single agonizing detail. I explained precisely how her beloved son had weaponized the power of attorney she had so blindly, lovingly granted him. He despised her overbearing, suffocating control so intensely that he had actively chosen to leave her with absolutely nothing. The $2 million currently sitting untouchable in a Zurich trust under Sienna's name was Brenda's money. It was entirely gone. Furthermore, I explained, because her massive pension had been heavily leveraged against her sprawling estate to maintain her affluent lifestyle, the regional bank had already triggered the automatic default clauses upon the fractional liquidations. Her domestic accounts were completely empty. The foreclosure protocols on her multi-million-dollar home were currently executing. She was utterly and permanently destitute, stripped of everything she owned by the very sun she worshipped. The reality of the absolute betrayal hit her with the concussive force of a physical blow. The aristocratic, unyielding armor finally shattered. Brenda let out a guttural, animalistic shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore through the polished courtroom. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the carpeted floor of the center aisle, tearing frantically at her pristine morning suit, screaming Gavin's name in a harrowing broken loop. The powerful matriarch who had tried to systematically destroy my life was now a crumpled, hollowed-out shell weeping on the floor of a municipal building. Judge Eris struck her gavel with resounding finality. She immediately invalidated the fraudulent holographic will, officially denying the ex parte motion and formally restoring my absolute legal ownership of the property and the entirety of my marital assets. The $5 million life insurance policy was instantly frozen, pending the forthcoming federal fraud investigation. But I was not simply walking away with my freedom. By officially submitting the comprehensive, meticulously mapped offshore laundering files to the federal authorities on the record, I had automatically triggered the IRS whistleblower program, exposing a multi-million-dollar international tax evasion and wire fraud syndicate guaranteed me a massive federally mandated percentage of the recovered offshore funds. I had not just reclaimed my life and cleared my name. I had secured immense, untouchable financial freedom. I stood up from the wooden chair and stepped down from the witness stand. I did not cast a second glance at the sobbing, ruined woman writhing on the aisle floor. I walked calmly past the petitioner's table, my head held high, the air in my lungs finally feeling clean. Rachel and Derek were waiting for me just outside the heavy double doors. Derek offered a rare, genuine smile of profound respect, while Rachel pulled me into a fierce, silent embrace. Together, the three of us walked down the sprawling concrete corridors of the courthouse, our footsteps echoing in perfect unison with the rhythm of absolute victory. We pushed through the heavy glass exit doors, leaving the shadows, the deceit, and the shattered ruins of my abusers far behind us, and stepped out into the brilliant, blinding warmth of the California sun. Blair's fight for justice teaches us a profound lesson about the indestructible nature of truth. Faced with unimaginable betrayal, lethal malice, and blind vengeance, Blair refused to crumble. Instead of surrendering to a fabricated narrative designed to destroy her, she weaponized logic and irrefutable evidence. This story powerfully illustrates that deceit, no matter how meticulously orchestrated or deeply buried in offshore accounts, will inevitably collapse under its own weight. True vindication requires the courage to stand firm when the entire world turns against you. What is the hardest truth you have ever had to uncover? Let me know in the comments below.